Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Your support is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. It was supposed to be just a weekend getaway. I had always been drawn to old hotels, fascinated by the history they held within their walls. So when my friends suggested we visit the Stanley Hotel, I jumped at the chance. Nestled in the heart of the Colorado Rockies, the hotel was known not just for its stunning architecture, but for the ghost stories that had swirled around it for over a century. It was famous for being the inspiration behind Stephen King's The Shining, and that alone was enough to entice me. When we arrived, the hotel was just as majestic as I had imagined. Its grand facade seemed to glow in the fading light of the afternoon, casting long shadows over the snow-covered grounds. As we checked in, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hotel itself was watching us, as if it were a living entity with secrets of its own. I laughed it off, attributing my unease to excitement. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. Our room was on the 4th floor, the same floor where countless guests had reported strange occurrences over the years. I wasn't one to buy into ghost stories, but as we walked down the long hallway, I felt a sudden coldness wash over me. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive, and the silence was deafening. We finally reached our room, and as soon as we stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind us with a force that rattled the walls. We both jumped, startled by the sudden noise, but again we shrugged it off, trying to remain calm. That night, we decided to explore the hotel. The corridors were eerily quiet, and as we wandered through the empty halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The walls seemed to close in around us, and every shadow seemed to shift and move just out of sight. We finally made our way to the grand staircase, a beautiful but imposing structure that spiraled up through the heart of the hotel. As we stood at the base, admiring its craftsmanship, I heard it a faint whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. I froze, straining to hear more, but the sound was gone. My friend looked at me, her face pale, and I knew she had heard it too. We quickly made our way back to the room, both of us too unnerved to continue our exploration. As we settled in for the night, I tried to push the strange occurrences out of my mind, convincing myself that it was all in my head. But as I lay there in the dark, I felt a presence in the room with us. It was subtle at first, a faint shift in the air, but then it grew stronger, more palpable. I could feel something standing at the foot of the bed, watching us. I didn't dare open my eyes, too afraid of what I might see. My heart raced, and I could hear my friend's breathing quicken beside me. The presence seemed to linger, for what felt like hours, its energy growing more and more oppressive with each passing moment. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air in the room lightened, and the tension that had gripped me slowly faded. I opened my eyes, and the room was just as it had been before, quiet and still. The next morning, we checked out as quickly as we could. Neither of us spoke about what had happened the night before, too afraid to acknowledge the strange and terrifying experience. But as we drove away from the Stanley Hotel, I couldn't help but glance back at the looming structure, its windows like dark eyes staring out at us as we left. I haven't returned to the Stanley Hotel since that weekend, and I'm not sure I ever will. There's something there, something dark and malevolent, waiting in the shadows for the next unsuspecting guest to arrive. And while I may never fully understand, what I experienced that night, I know one thing for certain: I'll never forget the feeling of being watched, of being surrounded by an unseen presence, and the overwhelming sense that something was lurking just beyond the veil of reality. As we drove away, the tension in my chest finally began to ease, but the images of the past night played over and over in my head. Sleep had evaded me completely, and my body felt on edge, like every nerve was exposed to the cold, hard reality that there are forces in this world that we don't understand. That night at the Stanley Hotel had torn away the comfortable barrier between the seen and the unseen. I didn't speak a word during the drive back. My friend kept glancing at me, her lips tight, her face pale. She was the type who never let anything get under her skin, but now her hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. It made me uneasy, seeing her so rattled, and it only amplified the feeling of dread that had settled deep inside me. As we drove further away, I found myself questioning everything that had happened. It wasn't just the cold spots, the whispers, or the strange movements in the shadows. It was the way the entire place seemed alive, pulsating with an energy that was almost tangible. It had felt like the hotel had a heartbeat, a rhythm that thrummed through the floors, the walls, and even the air itself. Was it simply the power of suggestion, knowing that this was the same place that inspired one of the most terrifying horror novels of all time? Or was it something more, something real, something that could reach out from the darkness and pull you into a realm where the rules of the natural world no longer apply? The memories of that night haunted me for weeks. Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the weight of that unseen presence pressing down on me, suffocating me with its intensity. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home, something dark and dangerous that had latched onto me the moment I set foot in the Stanley Hotel. I tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, that I was letting my imagination run wild, but deep down, I knew the truth. I wasn't alone. One night as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I felt that familiar chill run down my spine. The air in the room grew heavy, and I could feel the presence once again. It was there, standing in the corner of the room, watching me with unseeing eyes. My breath hitched in my throat, and I closed my eyes, willing it to go away. But it didn't. Instead, it moved closer, its energy growing more intense with every passing second. I could feel it hovering over me, its breath hot against my skin, and I knew that if I opened my eyes I would see it. My heart raced, my body paralyzed with fear, and then, just as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The air in the room lightened, and I was left gasping for breath, my body drenched in cold sweat. After that night, I knew I had to do something. I couldn't live like this, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting for the presence to show itself again. I began researching ways to cleanse my home, desperate to rid myself of whatever had attached itself to me. I contacted a local spiritualist, a woman who specialized in cleansing negative energies. She agreed to come to my house and perform a ritual to banish the dark presence that had taken up residence in my home. When she arrived, she immediately sensed the energy in the house. She moved through each room, burning sage and chanting softly under her breath. As she worked, I could feel the tension in the air begin to lift, the oppressive weight that had been suffocating me slowly dissipating. When she finally finished, she turned to me and smiled, her eyes filled with a quiet knowing. "It's gone," she said simply, "but you must be careful. Some places hold onto energy, and when you visit them, that energy can follow you home. Always protect yourself." I nodded, grateful for her help but still shaken by the experience. It had been weeks since our trip to the Stanley Hotel, and yet the effects of that one night had lingered, infecting every part of my life. I couldn't help but wonder if it truly was over, if the presence had really been banished, or if it was simply waiting, biding its time until it found another opportunity to strike. I've avoided places like the Stanley Hotel ever since, steering clear of any location with a reputation for hauntings or paranormal activity. I've learned my lesson. Some things are better left undisturbed, their secrets locked away in the shadows where they belong. But every now and then, when the air grows still and the night is at its darkest, I feel it again, that familiar chill that reminds me of the presence that once haunted my every step, and I wonder if maybe, just maybe, it's still out there, waiting for the right moment to return. I had been driving a taxi for almost a decade in the city, and in that time I'd picked up all kinds of passengers, drunks, tourists, late-night workers, and everything in between. I thought I'd seen it all until one night changed everything. It was a typical Friday evening just after midnight, and the city was still alive with the weekend crowd. I had just dropped off a couple of passengers at a downtown club, and I got a ping for a pickup in a quiet part of town. It was an older neighborhood, mostly residential, where the streets were lined with big, old houses that had been around for over a century. The kind of place that had history, and not all of it good. I followed the GPS to the address, but as I turned onto the street, something felt off. The road was dark with only a few flickering streetlights, and the houses loomed large, their windows like dark, empty eyes. There was an eerie stillness in the air, as if the whole neighborhood was holding its breath. I pulled up in front of the address and waited. It was an old Victorian-style house, its paint peeling and the front yard overgrown. The house looked abandoned, but I didn't think too much of it. Sometimes people like to live in places with character, I told myself. After a minute or two, I started to wonder if there was a mistake. I checked the app, and it said the passenger was on their way. I glanced at the house again, but there was no sign of life. Just as I was about to cancel the ride and move on, I saw her. She appeared out of the darkness, walking slowly towards the car. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned coat and hat, like something out of the 1940s. Her head was down, so I couldn't see her face clearly, but there was something about the way she moved that sent a shiver down my spine. She opened the back door and got in, sitting quietly behind me. "Good evening," I said, trying to sound cheerful, but there was no response. She just sat there, staring straight ahead. I asked her where she wanted to go, and she mumbled an address I didn't quite catch. I asked her to repeat it, and she said it again, clearer this time. It was a street on the other side of town, near the river. I knew the area well. It was even more isolated than where we were now. But a fare was a fare, so I nodded and started driving. The silence in the car was thick, almost oppressive. I tried to make small talk, asking if she was having a good night, but she didn't answer. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and for a split second I thought I saw something strange. Her face, it seemed blurred, like it wasn't fully there. I blinked, and it was gone. She was just sitting there, silent and still. I drove on, the city streets gradually emptying as we got closer to the river. The street lights became fewer and farther between, and the darkness closed in around us. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. As we approached the address she had given me, I noticed something odd. The GPS was acting up, the map on my phone flickering and glitching. I tapped the screen, trying to fix it, but it only got worse. The signal was cutting in and out, and the street names on the map were changing, becoming unreadable. "Is this where you wanted to go?" I asked, my voice shaky as I pulled up to the spot. We were near an old industrial area, long abandoned, with crumbling warehouses and overgrown lots. The place was a ghost town, and I hadn't seen another car or person for miles. She didn't answer. I turned around to ask her again, but when I looked in the back seat, she was gone. The door hadn't opened, and I hadn't heard her leave. She had just vanished. My heart skipped a beat, and I quickly got out of the car. Looking around, there was no one. Just empty streets and decaying buildings. I was alone, or so I thought. I got back into the car, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I didn't know what had just happened, but I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, not caring about the speed limits or the potholes in the road. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her sitting there again. But the back seat was empty. When I finally made it back to a more populated part of town, I pulled over, my heart racing. I needed to calm down to make sense of what had just happened. I checked the app, and there was no record of the ride. The address she had given me didn't exist, at least not anymore. The street had been renamed years ago, and the buildings there had been abandoned for decades. I didn't know what to think. I'd heard stories from other drivers about strange things happening during late-night shifts, but I had always dismissed them as just that, stories. Now I wasn't so sure. I finished my shift early that night and went home, but I couldn't sleep. The image of that woman, her blurred face, and the way she had just disappeared haunted me. I kept thinking about that old neighborhood where I had picked her up, the eerie silence, and the way the air had felt heavy, almost oppressive. A few days later, I decided to do some research. I found out that the house where I had picked her up had been abandoned for years. The last occupants had lived there in the 1940s, and according to the records, a woman had died there under mysterious circumstances. She had been waiting for her husband to return from the war, but he never came back. Some said she had gone mad with grief and taken her own life. Others said she had been waiting for him ever since. I don't drive that late at night anymore. I stick to the daytime shifts when the streets are busy and full of life. But sometimes, when I'm driving through certain parts of the city, I get that same feeling, the heaviness in the air, the sense of being watched. And I always check the back seat just to make sure I'm alone. I had always thought of myself as a pretty tough guy. After all, I'd spent years in the military, seen things that most people couldn't even imagine, and survived situations that would have broken others. So when I took the job as a night security guard at the old Baxter manufacturing plant, I figured it would be a piece of cake. It was just an empty factory. What could possibly go wrong? The plant had been shut down for years, left to rot after the company went bankrupt. The once bustling building was now a shell of its former self, filled with nothing but dust and memories. My job was simple. Make sure no one broke in and vandalized the place. The pay was decent, and the hours were quiet. I thought I'd be spending most of my shifts just sitting around, maybe reading a book or listening to the radio. But that first night, I realized how wrong I was. I arrived at the plant just before sunset, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange. The building loomed over me, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring back at me. The entrance was a heavy metal door, the paint peeling off in large chunks, revealing the rusted steel beneath. I unlocked it and stepped inside, the door creaking shut behind me with a sound that echoed through the empty halls. The interior was just as dilapidated as the outside. The walls were cracked, the floors covered in grime, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. I made my way to the security office, a small room with a desk, a chair, and a bank of old security monitors. The cameras were ancient, the black and white screens flickering with static, but they covered most of the plant's main areas. I settled into my chair, propped my feet up on the desk, and began my first shift. The first few hours passed uneventfully, the only sounds the distant hum of the city outside and the occasional creak of the building settling. I was almost starting to relax when something caught my eye on one of the monitors. It was a figure, just barely visible in the dim light, standing at the far end of the main production floor. At first I thought it was a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by one of the old machines, but then it moved. The figure was tall, unnaturally so, with long limbs that seemed to stretch in impossible ways. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to make out more details, but the image was too grainy. I told myself it was nothing, just some vagrant who had wandered in, maybe someone looking for shelter. But as I watched, the figure began to move slowly, deliberately, making its way across the production floor. Its movements were strange, almost mechanical, like it was gliding rather than walking. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my flashlight and headed out of the office, making my way toward the production floor. The building was eerily silent, the only sound the soft thud of my boots on the concrete floor. As I approached the area where I had seen the figure, I called out, "Hey, you're not supposed to be here. Show yourself." There was no response, just the echo of my voice bouncing off the walls. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, the beam cutting through the thick air. The old machines stood like silent sentinels, their rusted frames casting long shadows on the floor, but there was no sign of the figure. I walked the entire length of the production floor, my heart pounding in my chest, but I found nothing, no footprints, no disturbed dust, nothing. I returned to the security office, trying to shake off the feeling of unease that had settled over me. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the figure had been nothing more than a shadow. But as the night wore on, the feeling only grew stronger. I kept watching the monitors, my eyes scanning every inch of the screens, but the figure didn't reappear. The silence of the plant was oppressive, the kind that made you feel like you were being watched, even when you were alone. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that something was there, lurking just out of sight. And then, just as I was beginning to convince myself that I was being paranoid, the figure appeared again, this time on the monitor showing the hallway right outside the security office. I froze, my eyes locked on the screen. The figure was closer now, its form more distinct. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long arms that seemed to reach the floor. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, and its eyes, if they were eyes, were nothing more than empty, black voids. It stood there, motionless, as if it were waiting for something. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I bolted out of the office, my flashlight shaking in my hand as I ran down the hallway. I didn't know where I was going. I just needed to get away from whatever that thing was. My footsteps echoed in the empty halls, the sound almost deafening in the silence. I rounded a corner and nearly collided with one of the old machines. I stumbled, catching myself on a rusted conveyor belt, and that's when I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like metal scraping against metal. I turned, my flashlight sweeping the room, and there it was, standing in the doorway, its head tilted, watching me. For a moment I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure took a step toward me, its movements slow and deliberate, like it was savoring the moment. I forced myself to move, scrambling back the way I came, the figure following me at a steady pace. I burst through the doors of the plant and into the cold night air, my lungs burning from the effort. I didn't stop running until I was in my car, the engine roaring to life as I sped away from the building. I didn't look back, didn't want to see if the figure was still there, watching me. I quit the job the next day, didn't even bother to collect my last paycheck. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something I wanted to mess with. I've tried to forget about it, to convince myself that it was just a nightmare, a figment of my imagination. But sometimes, late at night, I can still see those black, empty eyes staring back at me, and I wonder if it's still there, waiting in the dark for its next victim. The cold wind whipped against my face as I trudged through the dense forest of black ridge, the crunch of fallen leaves beneath my boots the only sound that broke the silence. It was the peak of hunting season, and the forest was supposed to be alive with the sounds of wildlife. But that day it was deathly quiet. My breath formed little clouds in the frosty air as I tightened my grip on the rifle slung across my shoulder. I'd been hunting these woods for years, and I knew every trail, every hidden nook, yet something felt off. The forest, normally so familiar, seemed strange, as if it were hiding something from me. I had set out before dawn, hoping to track a deer I had been following for days. The prints were fresh, leading deeper into the thick underbrush. As I followed the trail, the trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The further I went, the more uneasy I felt. It wasn't just the silence. It was the feeling of being watched, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end as if something was lurking just out of sight. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just nerves. Hunting required patience, and I couldn't afford to let my imagination get the better of me. But as I continued, that feeling of unease grew stronger. I had been out here alone many times before, but this was different. It was like the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I reached a small clearing and stopped, crouching down to examine the tracks. They were too deep for a deer, I frowned, studying the shape of the prints. They were large, much larger than anything I'd ever seen before, with elongated toes and claw marks that dug into the earth. My first thought was a bear, but something about the shape was wrong. It was almost as if they were canine. I scanned the area, my eyes searching for any sign of movement, but the forest was still. I could feel my heart start to race as I slowly stood up, gripping my rifle a little tighter. The tracks led into a thicket of dense trees, where the shadows seemed to swallow the light. I hesitated for a moment, every instinct telling me to turn back, but curiosity got the better of me. I had to know what made those tracks. I pushed through the underbrush, the branches scratching against my jacket as I followed the trail. The forest was darker here, the trees thicker, the air heavy with the scent of pine and earth. The tracks became more erratic, as if whatever I was following was moving quickly, maybe even running. My pulse quickened as I imagined the creature, its powerful limbs propelling it through the forest, its eyes glowing in the darkness. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl that made my blood run cold. It was close to close. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the shadows. The growl came again, deep and menacing, vibrating through the air like a warning. I slowly raised my rifle, my hands shaking as I tried to steady my aim. The growl turned into a snarl, and I saw it just a glimpse of something moving between the trees, too fast for me to get a clear look. It was bigger than any wolf I'd ever seen, with fur as dark as the night and eyes that glinted with a savage intelligence. I felt a primal fear rise in me, the kind that made my stomach drop and my legs want to flee. But I stood my ground, every muscle in my body tense, as I waited for the creature to show itself. It circled me, its movement barely making a sound, a predator stalking its prey. I could hear its heavy breathing, the sound of its claws scraping against the ground, and then silence for what felt like an eternity. I stood there, my finger on the trigger, my eyes darting around, trying to see where it had gone. The silence was deafening, the kind that made my ears ring and my nerves scream. And then, just as suddenly as it had stopped, the sound returned, a rustling in the bushes, a blur of motion, and the creature was on me. I barely had time to react as it lunged from the shadows, a mass of fur and teeth. I fired my rifle, the shot echoing through the forest, but the creature was too fast. It knocked me to the ground, the impact knocking the wind out of me. I struggled, trying to push it off, but it was like fighting a mountain. Its weight pinned me down, its hot breath on my face as it snarled, revealing rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. In that moment, I thought I was going to die. The creature's eyes bore into mine, and I felt a primal terror that I had never experienced before. But then, just as suddenly as it had attacked, it hesitated. It looked at me, really looked at me, as if it was trying to decide what to do next. And then, with a final growl, it released me, disappearing back into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. I lay there for a moment, gasping for breath, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. When I finally managed to get to my feet, the forest was quiet again, the creature gone. I looked around, trying to see where it had gone, but there was nothing, no sign of the creature, no tracks, nothing. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed my rifle and ran, not stopping until I was back at my truck, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't look back as I sped down the dirt road, away from Black Ridge, away from whatever that thing was. I haven't been back to those woods since, and I don't plan to. Whatever I encountered that day, it wasn't something I ever want to see again. Some things are better left in the shadows, where they belong, but I can't shake the feeling that it's still out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. And I know that if I ever set foot in those woods again, it will be waiting for me. I've been a trucker for over 20 years, and I've driven through every corner of this country. I've seen all kinds of things on the road, wildlife, weather, weirdos, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night on the Big Sur coast. It was late fall, just before Thanksgiving, and I was hauling a load of produce from Salinas down to Los Angeles. The sun had set hours ago, and I was cruising along Highway 1, the Pacific Ocean on my right, and the rugged cliffs of Big Sur rising to my left. The road was winding and narrow, but I knew it well enough to feel confident driving it at night. The only downside to this route was that it was pretty isolated. There weren't many places to stop, and cell service was spotty at best. I had been on the road for a few hours, and I was getting tired, but I wanted to make it to a rest stop near Cambria before calling it a night. The moon was nearly full, casting a silvery light over the ocean and the landscape. Everything was quiet except for the hum of my engine and the occasional rustle of the wind through the trees. As I rounded a particularly sharp curve, something caught my eye on the side of the road. It was just a flash, something dark moving quickly through the trees. At first I thought it was a deer or maybe a bear. Both were common enough in these parts. But as I drove on, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was big. I kept one eye on the road and the other on the tree line, scanning for any sign of movement. The road straightened out, and I eased off the gas, my heart starting to race for reasons I couldn't quite explain. The landscape around me was rugged and wild, with dense forests that seemed to go on forever, the kind of place where anything could be hiding. I was about to write it off as just another animal sighting when it happened. Out of nowhere, a massive shape stepped onto the road about 50 yards in front of me. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as I struggled to bring the truck to a stop. The creature was illuminated by my headlights, and for a moment I couldn't believe what I was seeing. It was huge, at least 8 feet tall, covered in thick, dark fur that seemed almost black in the night. It walked on 2 legs like a man, but there was nothing human about it. Its arms were long, reaching nearly to its knees, and its hands ended in sharp, claw-like fingers. The face was what really got me flat, with deep-set eyes that glowed a dull red in the light. It was like something out of a nightmare. The creature stared at me for what felt like an eternity, its eyes locking onto mine through the windshield. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it let out a low, guttural growl that rumbled through the cab of my truck, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It turned and loped off into the trees, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had come. I sat there, my hands white-knuckled on the steering wheel, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to turn around and get out of there as fast as I could, but another part of me, the curious part, wanted to follow it, to see where it went. But I wasn't that stupid. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't something I wanted to mess with. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves, and slowly eased the truck forward. As I passed the spot where the creature had been standing, I glanced into the trees, but there was nothing. Just darkness and shadows. The rest of the drive was a blur. I kept checking the mirrors, half expecting to see the creature running after me, but the road remained empty. When I finally reached a rest stop, I pulled in and parked, my hands still shaking as I turned off the engine. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, trying to make sense of it. I knew what I had seen, but it didn't make any sense. There were stories, of course, about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest, but I had always dismissed them as nonsense. I mean, how could something that big exist without being discovered? But after what I saw that night, I wasn't so sure. The next day, I finished my run to Los Angeles, but I couldn't get the image of that creature out of my mind. I didn't tell anyone about it at first. Who would believe me? But a few days later, I was talking with some other truckers at a diner, and I mentioned that I'd had a strange experience on Highway 1. One of the guys, an older driver named Bill, looked at me real serious and asked, "You saw it, didn't you?" I nodded, and he leaned in closer. "You're not the first," he said. "There have been sightings up and down the coast for years. Most folks don't talk about it because they don't want to be called crazy. But it's out there, all right. I've seen it myself a couple of times, always at night, always near the woods. We talked for a while, swapping stories and theories. Some of the guys thought it was just a bear with a bad case of mange, but Bill and I knew better. There was something out there, something big and unknown, and it wasn't just a bear. I kept driving the Big Sur route after that, but I was more cautious, more alert. I never saw the creature again, but every time I passed that stretch of road, I couldn't help but feel like I was being watched. I never forgot that night, and I doubt I ever will. I don't know what the creature was or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure: there are things out there in the dark that we don't understand, and some of them are better left alone. I was never one to believe in the supernatural, ghosts, spirits, And all those things you hear about in horror movies were just that, stories meant to entertain or frighten those with overactive imaginations. But after what happened to me one summer evening, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started when my wife and I decided to invite a few friends over for a casual dinner. We had just moved into a new house, a charming old place with creaky floorboards and a lot of character. It had been a long week of unpacking and settling in, so we thought it would be nice to have some company and show off our new home. We spent a day preparing, cooking up a storm in the kitchen. The aroma of roasted chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and freshly baked bread filled the air, and by the time our guests arrived, the house felt warm and inviting. It was the kind of evening that made you feel content and at ease. Our friends arrived one by one, and soon the house was filled with laughter and conversation. We all gathered around the dining table, clinking glasses of wine and toasting to new beginnings. It was a perfect evening until it started with a strange feeling, a sudden shift in the atmosphere. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something felt off. The laughter in the room seemed to fade into the background, replaced by an uncomfortable silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. I glanced around the table, and I could tell that I wasn't the only one who felt it. Our guests exchanged uneasy looks, their smiles faltering as the mood in the room shifted from jovial to tense, and noticed it, too. She leaned over to me, her voice barely above a whisper. "Do you feel that?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. I nodded, unable to shake the growing sense of unease that was creeping up my spine. And then, out of nowhere, the front door opened. It didn't creak or groan like you'd expect from an old house. It just opened silently, almost as if it was being pushed by an unseen hand. We all turned our heads toward the entrance, expecting to see someone there, but the doorway was empty. The door stood wide open, and beyond it the night was dark and still. For a moment, no one moved. We all just stared at the open door, a sense of dread settling over us. I could feel my heart start to race, my mind struggling to come up with a rational explanation. Maybe one of us had forgotten to close it properly. Maybe it was just the wind. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut with a force that rattled the windows. The sound echoed through the house, making us all jump in our seats, and let out a small gasp, her hand flying to her mouth as she stared at the door in shock. One of our friends, Mark, was the first to speak. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. No one answered. We were all too stunned to say anything, our eyes still locked on the door as if we expected it to fly open again at any moment. The silence that followed was suffocating, the kind that makes your ears ring and your skin crawl. And then we heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like someone whispering just out of earshot. It was so faint that at first I thought I was imagining it. But when I saw the expressions on everyone else's faces, I knew they heard it too. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, though the words were still impossible to make out. It seemed to be coming from the hallway just beyond the dining room. My heart pounded in my chest as I strained to listen, trying to decipher what was being said, but the more I listened, the more the words seemed to slip away, like trying to catch smoke with your bare hands, and stood up, her face pale. "I think we should leave," she said, her voice shaking. The rest of us nodded in agreement, none of us wanting to stay in that house a moment longer. We all got up from the table, moving quickly toward the front door, but before we could reach it, the lights flickered and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. I could hear Anne's panicked breathing beside me, the sound of our friends stumbling around in the dark, trying to find their way. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, until it was a cacophony of voices all speaking at once, filling the air with a terrible, unintelligible noise. I fumbled for my phone, the light from the screen casting an eerie glow in the pitch-black room. But as I tried to turn on the flashlight, the phone slipped from my hand and hit the floor with a sickening crack. The light went out, leaving us in complete darkness once again. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the noise had been. We stood there, frozen in place, listening for any sound, any indication that the nightmare was over, but all we heard was the sound of our own ragged breathing, the rapid thumping of our hearts in our chests. Finally, Mark spoke up again, his voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get out of here," he said, his tone filled with urgency. We didn't need any more convincing. We made our way toward the door as quickly as we could in the dark, bumping into furniture and tripping over each other in our haste to leave. When we finally reached the door, it wouldn't budge. I yanked on the handle with all my strength, but it was as if the door had been sealed shut. Panic set in as I pounded on the wood, shouting for help, but the only response was the oppressive silence that surrounded us. Just when I thought we were trapped for good, the door suddenly flew open, nearly knocking me off my feet. We didn't waste any time. We bolted out of the house, into the night, not stopping until we were far away from that place. When we finally stopped to catch our breath, we turned to look back at the house. It stood there in the darkness, silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But we all knew better. Something had been in that house with us, something that didn't want us there. We never went back to that house. We never spoke about what happened that night, not really. But I know we all felt it, the presence of something dark and malevolent, something that had been waiting for us. We were lucky to get out when we did, but I can't help but wonder what would have happened if we hadn't. I never believed the stories. Who would? A 7-foot-tall creature, half man, half elf, roaming the forests of Michigan? It sounded like something out of a cheap horror movie, not something you'd actually encounter in the middle of nowhere. But after what happened to me, I don't just believe I know. It was early autumn, the kind of season where the air is crisp, and the leaves crunch beneath your boots with every step. I had taken a few days off work, needing a break from the grind, and decided to go on a solo camping trip. Just me, the trees, and a week of nothing but nature. It sounded perfect. The place I picked was remote, deep in the heart of the Manistee National Forest. I'd been there a few times before, but never this far out. The deeper you go, the fewer people you see. That was the point, though no cell service, no distractions, just peace. I set up camp by a small, secluded lake, a perfect spot surrounded by dense trees. The first day was uneventful, just the way I wanted it. I fished, I hiked, I sat by the fire, and let the stillness of the forest settle over me like a blanket. By the time the sun set, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. It wasn't until the second night that things started to get weird. I was sitting by the fire, enjoying the warmth, when I heard something in the distance. A low, rumbling growl, so deep it vibrated in my chest. At first I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a bear, but it didn't sound quite right. It was too deliberate to close. I stood up, scanning the trees around me, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. The firelight only reached so far, and beyond that was nothing but black. The growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. No crickets, no rustling leaves, nothing, just silence. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the isolation get to me. But deep down I knew something was out there, watching me. I tried to shake it off, but that night in the tent I couldn't sleep. Every little noise made me jump. Every whisper of the wind sounded like something lurking just outside. At one point I could have sworn I heard something brushing against the side of the tent, like claws scraping against the fabric. I lay there, frozen, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. By the time morning came, I was exhausted. I almost packed up and left, but stubbornness got the better of me. I wasn't about to let a few strange noises ruin my trip, so I stayed, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The third day was calm, almost too calm. I hiked further into the forest, trying to shake the unease that had settled in my gut. But no matter how far I went, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It was like eyes were following me, tracking my every move. That night I decided to keep the fire going as long as possible. There was something comforting about the flames, the way they pushed back the darkness. But even with the fire blazing, I felt vulnerable, exposed. It was around midnight when I heard it again. That growl. But this time it was closer, much closer. I stood up, heart pounding, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. The growl was followed by a series of low, guttural noises, like something was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. And then I saw them, eyes glowing, yellow eyes, staring at me from the edge of the firelight. They were too high off the ground to be any normal animal, too wide set to be human. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The creature stepped forward just enough for me to see its outline. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and long, muscular limbs. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, and its face was a nightmare. I knew then what I was looking at: the dogman. The creature that was supposed to be just a legend, just a story to scare kids. But it was real, standing there, watching me. For a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us moving. I don't know how long we stood like that, but it felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, the dogman bared its teeth, letting out a low, rumbling growl that sent a wave of terror through me. I snapped out of my trance, and did the only thing I could think of. I grabbed the nearest burning log from the fire and held it out in front of me like a weapon. The dogman snarled, but it didn't move. It just watched me, those eyes burning into mine. I don't know what made it leave. Maybe it was the fire, or maybe it was just toying with me. But after what felt like forever, the dogman backed away, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if it would come back. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking so badly I could barely work the tent poles. I left everything else behind: my food, my supplies, even my favorite fishing rod. I didn't care. I just needed to get out of those woods, to get away from whatever that thing was. I hiked through the night, not stopping until I reached my car at the edge of the forest. Even then, I didn't feel safe. The drive home was a blur, my mind racing with what I had seen, what had almost happened. It's been months since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling that I am being watched. I see those eyes in my dreams, hear that growl in the silence of my home. I haven't been back to the wood since, and I don't think I ever will. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't meant to be seen by human eyes. I know people won't believe me. They'll say it was just a bear, or that I was imagining things, but I know the truth. The dogman is real, and it's out there, waiting in the dark for someone else to cross its path. The first thing that hit me as I walked into Shady Pines Hospital was the smell. It wasn't the usual antiseptic odor you'd expect in a hospital. No, this was something else, something older, like a mix of mildew and rot, as if the walls themselves were decaying. I was there as a new night shift nurse, a job I had taken out of desperation. After being laid off from my previous position, the hospital was an old building, standing on the outskirts of town, long forgotten by the world and avoided by most of the locals. They said it was haunted, but I didn't pay much attention to those stories. After all, I was a nurse, trained in science and reason, not superstition. My first night started off quiet enough. The head nurse, Betty, was a stern woman in her 50s who looked like she had seen it all. She gave me a quick tour of the place, pointing out the various wards and rooms, most of which were empty. "We don't get many patients anymore," she said in a flat tone, her voice echoing down the dimly lit corridors. "Mostly elderly folks with no family, some mental cases. Just do your rounds, keep an eye on things, and you'll be fine." Fine. That was a word I would never associate with Shady Pines after that night. I started my rounds, checking in on the few patients we had. Most of them were sleeping, their breaths slow and raspy. The building was quiet, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the distant hum of the old boiler in the basement. As I walked down the long hallway toward the east wing, I felt a sudden chill in the air. It was strange because the rest of the hospital was almost unbearably warm due to the old heating system. But here the temperature dropped drastically, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I stopped in my tracks, a sense of unease creeping over me. I shook it off and continued walking, telling myself it was just a draft or maybe a malfunctioning vent. But then I heard the faint sound of crying, echoing through the hall. It was so soft at first that I thought it was just the wind, but as I moved closer to one of the closed doors, it became clearer, more distinct. It was the sound of a woman sobbing, a low, mournful wail that sent shivers down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, then reached for the doorknob. The door creaked open, revealing a small, empty room. The crying stopped immediately, replaced by an eerie silence that made my skin crawl. I stepped inside, scanning the room, but there was no sign of anyone or anything that could have made that sound. I backed out of the room and closed the door, my heart racing. I tried to convince myself that I was just imagining things, that the stories about Shady Pines were getting to me. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. As I continued my rounds, the hospital seemed to come alive with strange sounds, whispers, footsteps, the faint rustling of sheets. Every time I turned a corner or opened a door, I expected to see someone, but there was never anyone there. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing hour, and by the time my shift was half over, I was a bundle of nerves. It was around 3 a.m. when things took a turn for the worse. I was in the central ward, checking on an elderly patient named Mr. Thompson. He was one of the few who was still somewhat lucid, though his body was frail and his mind often wandered. As I adjusted his blankets, he suddenly grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. His eyes, which had been dull and glassy, were now wide open, filled with terror. "They're here," he whispered, his voice trembling. "The spirits, they come at night. They take the souls of the weak, the lost." I pulled my hand away, trying to calm him down, but he wouldn't let go. His grip tightened, and his voice grew more frantic. "You have to get out before they take you too." I managed to free myself and hurried out of the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to leave, to run out of that place and never look back, but I couldn't just abandon my post. I told myself that Mr. Thompson was just delirious, that his mind was playing tricks on him. But deep down, I was starting to believe him. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and confusion. The strange noises grew louder, more insistent. Doors that I knew I had closed were suddenly open, and lights flickered on and off with no explanation. At one point I heard the sound of gurney wheels squeaking down the hall, but when I ran to see who it was, the hallway was empty. The final straw came just before dawn. I was in the break room trying to collect my thoughts when the door slammed shut behind me. I jumped, spilling my coffee, and spun around to see if someone was there. The room was empty, but I could feel a presence, something cold and malevolent, pressing in on me from all sides. Then, out of nowhere, I heard a voice, clear as day, whispering in my ear, "Leave while you still can." That was it. I bolted out of the break room, down the hallway, and out the front doors without looking back. I didn't care about my job anymore. All I wanted was to get as far away from that cursed place as possible. I never went back to Shady Pines. I quit the next day without even bothering to collect my things. I couldn't bear the thought of stepping foot in that building again. I tried to move on with my life, but the memories of that night still haunt me. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, hearing those same whispers, feeling that same icy presence. I don't know what was really going on in that hospital, and I don't want to know. All I know is that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that should be left alone. And if you ever find yourself at Shady Pines, do yourself a favor and stay far, far away. It was just another night shift, or so I thought. I had been driving taxis in the city for years, and I had seen my share of strange passengers and odd occurrences, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that night. I was on my usual route, cruising through the quieter parts of town, waiting for the next fare. It was around 2 a.m., the streets almost deserted, save for the occasional car passing by or the distant sound of a police siren. I was about to call it a night when the dispatcher's voice crackled over the radio. "We've got a pickup request on Holloway Road, near the old cemetery," he said, sounding as tired as I felt. Holloway Road wasn't a place I frequented much. It was an old, narrow street that wound through a rundown part of town. The cemetery there was ancient, filled with crumbling tombstones and overgrown grass. It was a place most people avoided, especially at night. But a fare was a fare, so I turned the cab in that direction. As I approached the cemetery, the air grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes you shiver. I pulled up to the curb near the entrance, where a thick fog had started to roll in, swirling around the graves like some ghostly mist. I glanced around, expecting to see someone waiting for me, but the street was empty. I checked the address again, thinking I might have made a mistake, but no, this was the right place. I was about to radio the dispatcher to double-check when I saw her. A woman appeared out of the fog, walking slowly towards the cab. She was dressed in an old-fashioned black dress that reached down to her ankles, her long dark hair hanging loose around her face. There was something off about her, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up, but I couldn't put my finger on it. She moved with an eerie grace, her steps almost silent as she approached the passenger door. Without a word, she opened it and got in, settling into the back seat. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, there was something about her eyes that made me want to look away, a deep sadness that seemed to reach into my soul. "Where to?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She looked at me through the rearview mirror, her gaze intense, and then she spoke in a soft, almost whispering voice. "Take me home," I nodded and put the car in gear, but she didn't give me an address. I hesitated, glancing back at her, but she just sat there, staring out the window as if lost in her own world. "Where's home?" I asked again, hoping for some clarification. She finally turned to me, and in that moment, her expression changed. Her eyes, once filled with sadness, now held something darker, something that sent a chill down my spine. "You know the way," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Against my better judgment, I started driving. I didn't know where I was going, but something some unseen force seemed to guide me. The fog outside grew thicker, the streets becoming more unfamiliar with each turn. I felt as though I was being led deeper into a maze, a place where the city's familiar landmarks faded away, replaced by shadowy streets and flickering streetlights. After what felt like an eternity, I found myself on an old, narrow road that I didn't recognize. The buildings on either side were dark and decrepit, their windows shattered, and their doors hanging open as if they had been abandoned for years. I had no idea where I was, and the woman in the back seat offered no guidance, just sat there in silence. My heart was pounding, and I could feel sweat trickling down my back despite the cold. Something was very wrong, but I couldn't stop. It was as if I was in a trance, my hands gripping the wheel tightly as I drove deeper into the unknown. Finally, I reached the end of the road. Ahead of me was an old house, its wooden frame sagging with age, the windows dark and foreboding. The place looked like it hadn't been inhabited in decades, and yet there was a faint light flickering in one of the upstairs windows. I stopped the car and turned to the woman, but the back seat was empty. She was gone, vanished without a trace. Panic surged through me as I frantically looked around, but there was no sign of her, no open door, nothing to indicate she had ever been there. My hands were shaking as I fumbled with the radio, trying to call the dispatcher, but all I got was static. The air in the car had turned icy, my breath visible in the dim light. I didn't know what to do. Every instinct screamed at me to get out of there, but something compelled me to stay, to see this through. Against my better judgment, I got out of the cab and approached the house. The air was heavy with an oppressive silence, broken only by the creaking of the old wooden steps as I climbed the porch. The door was slightly ajar, and with a trembling hand I pushed it open. Inside, the house was as decrepit as it looked from the outside. The walls were lined with peeling wallpaper, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. Dust hung in the air, catching the faint light from the window above. I called out, but my voice echoed back to me, swallowed by the emptiness. As I ventured further inside, I noticed a framed photograph hanging on the wall, covered in a thick layer of dust. I wiped it clean with my sleeve and froze when I saw the image. It was the woman, the same one who had been in my cab, standing in front of this very house, dressed in that same old-fashioned black dress. But the photograph was old, very old, and the edges were yellowed with age. She couldn't possibly be the same person. The floor creaked above me, snapping me out of my thoughts. I looked up towards the ceiling, where the faint light was coming from, and felt a cold dread settle in my gut. I had to leave. I had to get out of this house before something terrible happened. But as I turned to go, I heard her voice whispering my name, calling me to come upstairs. I don't know what possessed me to follow that voice, but I did. The stairs groaned under my weight, each step feeling like it could give way at any moment. When I reached the top, I saw the door to the room at the end of the hall was open, the light spilling out into the darkness. With trembling hands, I pushed the door wider and stepped inside. The room was empty, save for a single chair facing the window. The light was coming from a small, flickering candle on the windowsill, and there, in the chair, sat the woman, her back to me. My heart was in my throat as I approached her, my footsteps barely making a sound on the old wooden floor. I reached out, intending to touch her shoulder, to ask who she was, but before I could, she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't have come here." And then, before my eyes, she began to dissolve into the air, her form becoming translucent, until she vanished completely, leaving nothing but the empty chair behind. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over my own feet, and ran out of the room, down the stairs, and out of the house as fast as I could. When I reached the cab, I found the engine was still running, the headlights cutting through the fog. I jumped in and slammed the door, peeling away from that place without looking back. I drove straight to the nearest open diner, my hands still shaking as I ordered a coffee, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I went back to Holloway Road, unable to shake the feeling that I needed to see that house in the daylight. But when I got there, the road was empty. There was no house, no sign that it had ever existed. I asked around, but no one had ever heard of a house at the end of that road. It was as if it had never been there at all. To this day, I don't know who or what that woman was, or what she wanted, but I'll never forget her face, the sadness in her eyes, or the chilling words she spoke to me in that old, decrepit house that should never have been there. All I know is that I'll never take another fare near Holloway Road, no matter how desperate I am for work. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend away. I'd been looking forward to it for weeks, a chance to escape the city, clear my mind, and enjoy the solitude of nature. My friend Mike and I had planned a hiking trip up in the northern woods, a remote area known for its dense forests and breathtaking views. We'd been on plenty of hikes before, but this one was different. This time we were venturing into the heart of the wilderness, far from the well-worn trails and tourist spots. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and set off early Friday morning. The drive took us through miles of rugged terrain, winding roads that seemed to stretch on forever. As we got closer to our destination, the landscape grew more and more desolate. The trees became taller, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers, casting long shadows across the road. By the time we arrived at the trailhead, the sun was beginning to set, casting an orange glow over the horizon. We grabbed our packs, checked our maps, and set off into the woods. The trail was narrow and overgrown, but we were confident in our abilities. We'd hiked tougher paths before, and this one didn't seem too daunting. As we ventured deeper into the forest, the sounds of civilization faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. We hiked for several hours, the darkness slowly enveloping us. We hadn't planned on hiking at night, but we were making good time and decided to push on a bit further before setting up camp. The moon was full, casting a pale light through the trees, enough to see by, but not enough to shake the feeling that we were being watched. I brushed it off as paranoia, telling myself that it was just the isolation getting to me. But as the hours passed, the feeling only grew stronger. We finally decided to set up camp in a small clearing, surrounded by towering pines. Mike started a fire while I pitched the tent, both of us working in silence. There was an unspoken tension between us, a sense that something wasn't right, but neither of us wanted to admit it. We sat by the fire, eating our rations, and talking about nothing in particular, trying to distract ourselves from the creeping unease. The fire crackled, casting flickering shadows on the trees around us. The night was eerily quiet, the usual sounds of the forest conspicuously absent. We tried to laugh it off, but it felt forced. After a while, Mike decided to call it a night. He crawled into the tent, leaving me alone by the fire. I wasn't tired yet, so I stayed up, staring into the flames, lost in thought. The silence was almost oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I tried to focus on the warmth of the fire, but my mind kept drifting back to that feeling of being watched. Suddenly, I heard a sound. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but it was there, a soft rustling in the underbrush, like something moving just beyond the circle of light cast by the fire. I froze, my heart racing as I strained to listen. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a low growl. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't an animal I recognized, not a bear or a wolf. This was something different, something wrong. I grabbed the flashlight and shone it into the darkness, but the beam only illuminated the dense wall of trees surrounding the clearing. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it, whatever it was, lurking just out of sight. I called out to Mike, but he didn't respond. He must have been asleep, oblivious to the growing danger. The growling grew louder, more insistent, and then I saw its glowing eyes staring back at me from the shadows. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and they were filled with a malevolent intelligence that sent chills down my spine. The thing in the darkness let out a guttural snarl, and I knew I had to act fast. I scrambled to my feet, backing away from the fire as I frantically tried to wake Mike. He stirred, groggy and confused, but I didn't have time to explain. "We have to go now," I whisper urgently, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet. He must have seen the fear in my eyes because he didn't argue. We grabbed what we could and started running, abandoning the tent and most of our gear. We didn't stop to look back, just kept running deeper into the forest, away from whatever was stalking us. The trees closed in around us, the path barely visible in the dim light. I could hear the thing behind us, crashing through the underbrush, gaining on us with every step. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop, not with that thing on our heels. We stumbled through the woods, our only goal to put as much distance between us and the creature as possible. But no matter how fast we ran, it was always there, just behind us, its growls growing louder, more menacing. At one point I tripped over a root and went sprawling to the ground. Mike helped me up, but I could see the fear in his eyes, the realization that we might not make it out of this alive. We kept running until we broke through the tree line, finding ourselves on the edge of a steep ravine. The drop was sheer, the bottom lost in the darkness below. We were trapped. The creature emerged from the trees, stepping into the moonlight for the first time. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, skeletal limbs and a face that was more beast than human. Its skin was pale, stretched tight over its bones and its eyes. Its eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to swallow the light. Mike and I backed away, inching closer to the edge of the ravine. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The thing took a step towards us, its movements slow, deliberate, like it was savoring the fear that radiated off us in waves. My mind was racing, searching for any way out, any chance of survival. But there was nothing. We were out of options. And then, just as it seemed all hope was lost, Mike did something I'll never forget. He turned to me, a grim determination in his eyes, and shoved me as hard as he could. I stumbled backward, losing my balance and tumbling over the edge of the ravine. I don't remember the fall, only the cold shock of the water as I hit the river below. The current was strong, pulling me downstream, away from the cliff. I struggled to stay afloat, my body battered by the rocks and debris in the water. When I finally managed to drag myself onto the shore. I was miles away from the ravine, soaked and shivering. I never saw Mike again. I don't know what happened to him, but I like to think that he fought, that he bought me the time I needed to escape. I spent hours wandering through the forest, trying to find my way back to civilization. Eventually, I stumbled upon a logging road where a group of workers found me, half dead from exhaustion and exposure. I told them what had happened, but they didn't believe me. They chalked it up to delirium, a product of my injuries and the trauma of losing my friend. But I know what I saw. I know that the thing in the woods wasn't human, wasn't anything that should exist in this world. They never found Mike's body, and the authorities ruled his disappearance as an unfortunate accident. But I know the truth. There's something out there, something ancient and evil, lurking in the deep woods, waiting for its next victim. I haven't been back to the wilderness since that night, and I never will, because I know that if I do, it'll be waiting for me, those hollow eyes watching from the shadows, ready to finish what it started. It was the summer of 2020, during the peak of the lockdown, and the world felt like it had come to a standstill. I had recently moved into a new apartment, a tiny one-bedroom in a quiet part of town. It was an old building with creaky floors and walls that seemed too thin for comfort, but the price was right, and I wasn't in a position to be picky. The isolation got to me after a while. Being stuck inside day after day with nothing but the news and social media for company was slowly driving me insane. So I started taking walks at night just to clear my head. The streets were empty, the world quiet in a way that was both peaceful and unsettling. But I didn't mind. It was a chance to escape the four walls of my apartment, to breathe in the cool night air and feel some semblance of normalcy. One night, I decided to change up my usual route. Instead of sticking to the main roads, I wandered into a part of town I wasn't familiar with. The streets were narrower, the buildings older, and the street lights dimmer. It wasn't the kind of place I would normally venture into, but that night I didn't care. I just kept walking, letting my feet guide me. After a while, I found myself in front of an old, abandoned factory. The building was massive, its windows boarded up, and its exterior covered in graffiti. It had probably been empty for years, a relic of a time when this town had been bustling with industry. Now it was just a forgotten husk, a shadow of its former self. I should have turned back. There was no reason to keep going, no reason to get any closer, but something about the place drew me in. Maybe it was the curiosity, or maybe it was the boredom of the lockdown, but I found myself walking towards it, my heart pounding in my chest. The front gate was chained shut, but the fence had a hole in it, big enough for me to slip through. I hesitated for a moment, my instincts screaming at me to leave, but I ignored them. I told myself I'd just take a quick look, see what was inside, and then head home. The interior was dark, the air thick with dust and the smell of decay. I pulled out my phone and used the flashlight to guide my way. The place was massive, filled with old machinery and debris. Every step I took echoed through the empty halls, the sound bouncing off the walls and making it feel like I wasn't alone. I wandered deeper into the factory, my footsteps the only sound in the stillness. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a faint whisper coming from somewhere deeper in the building. It was so soft I almost thought I was imagining it. But then I heard it again, clearer this time, a voice barely audible, calling out a name. My name. My blood ran cold. There was no way anyone knew I was here. I hadn't told anyone about my midnight walks, let alone about this detour. But the voice was unmistakable, and it was getting closer. Panic set in, and I turned to leave, but the way out seemed much farther than it should have been. The shadows seemed to stretch, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and I could feel something following me, something just out of sight. I started running, not caring about the noise I was making, just desperate to get out. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. The factory seemed to twist and turn around me, the exit always just out of reach. Finally, I saw the light of my phone reflecting off the broken window, and I bolted towards it. I didn't stop until I was outside, the cool night air hitting me like a wave. I didn't look back. I just ran, faster than I ever had in my life, until I was far away from that place. When I got home, I locked every door, every window, and sat in the middle of the room, my back against the wall, trying to calm down. My phone was still in my hand, the flashlight on, illuminating the room in harsh, white light. That's when I noticed it, a handprint, smeared in dust, on the screen of my phone. Not mine, but someone else's. The fingers were too long, the palm too wide, and it was pressed against the glass like someone had tried to grab it from me. I dropped the phone, my heart racing again. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. The whispers were gone, but the feeling of being watched, of something being there with me, lingered. The next day, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was just my imagination, the stress of the lockdown getting to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something had been in that factory with me, something that knew my name, something that had followed me home. I haven't gone for a walk at night since. The factory is still there, a looming presence at the edge of town, but I avoid it at all costs. And every night, as I lie in bed, I can still hear those whispers calling my name from the shadows, reminding me that I'm never really alone. I wasn't supposed to be there. Whitmore Asylum had been closed for decades, left to decay in the heart of the woods like some forgotten relic of the past. I'd heard the stories. Of course, everyone in town had. They said the place was cursed, that the spirits of the patients who had died there still lingered, unable to find peace. But I never believed in that sort of thing. To me, it was just an old building, a piece of history that had been left to rot. I was a photographer, always on the lookout for new and interesting subjects. The asylum had been on my list for years, but it was off limits, surrounded by a rusted chain-link fence with signs warning trespassers to keep out. The town had tried to sell the property, but no one wanted it. So there it sat, forgotten and alone, slowly being reclaimed by the forest. That didn't stop the local kids from sneaking in, though. They'd dare each other to spend the night in the old building, tell ghost stories around a campfire in the courtyard, and leave graffiti on the crumbling walls. But I wasn't a kid, and I wasn't interested in silly games. I wanted to capture the place in all its eerie, decaying glory, so one night I decided to do just that. I waited until after dark, when the streets were quiet and the town was asleep. I packed my camera, a flashlight, and a few other supplies, then drove out to the asylum. The gate was easy enough to get through. A section of the fence had been cut away, leaving just enough room for me to squeeze through. The building loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the night sky. As I approached, I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, a heaviness in the air that made it hard to breathe. The front doors were boarded up, but I found an open window around the side. I hoisted myself up and climbed inside, landing in what used to be the main lobby. The floor was covered in dust, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew and decay. My flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing peeling wallpaper, broken furniture, and graffiti-covered walls. I took a few shots, the flash of my camera briefly illuminating the room. The silence was overwhelming, the only sound the distant creaking of the building settling. I made my way down the hallway, stepping carefully to avoid the debris scattered across the floor. The place was a maze of narrow corridors and locked doors, some of which had been pried open over the years by curious trespassers. I wasn't interested in the vandalized areas, though. I wanted to find something untouched, something that would capture the true essence of the asylum. I explored for hours, taking photos of everything that caught my eye. The old examination rooms, with their rusted equipment and stained mattresses, the long-forgotten record still sitting in filing cabinets, the barred windows that had once held back the patients from their freedom. But as the night wore on, I began to feel uneasy. It wasn't just the creepy atmosphere of the place, there was something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if the very walls were watching me, judging me for intruding on their secrets. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, but then I started hearing things. At first, it was just a faint whisper, so soft that I wasn't sure if I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time, a voice speaking words I couldn't understand. I froze, straining to listen, but the voice was gone as quickly as it had appeared. I shook my head, trying to clear the cobwebs from my mind. I was just tired, I told myself. I'd been wandering around this place for hours, and it was starting to get to me. But then I heard it again, closer this time, a soft, feminine voice, calling out a name. My blood ran cold. I turned around, shining my flashlight down the hallway behind me. Nothing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, revealing only the empty corridor I had just walked down. But the voice was still there, whispering my name over and over again, coming from somewhere deep within the asylum. I knew I should leave, that I should turn around and get the hell out of there. But something compelled me to keep going, to follow the voice as it led me deeper into the building. I walked down the hallway, my heart pounding in my chest, the voice growing louder with every step. It was leading me somewhere, drawing me towards it like a moth to a flame. I reached a door at the end of the hall, the wood rotting and splintered from years of neglect. The voice was coming from the other side, a soft, mournful cry that sent shivers down my spine. I hesitated for a moment, my hand hovering over the doorknob. Every instinct in my body was telling me to turn back, to run away, and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to see what was behind that door. I took a deep breath and pushed it open. The room was small, barely large enough to fit a bed and a small table. The walls were lined with padded fabric, torn and stained with age. It was a cell, a place where they had kept the most dangerous patients. And in the corner, curled up in a ball, was a figure. My heart skipped a beat as I realized it was a woman. Her hair was long and matted, her skin pale and almost translucent in the dim light. She was wearing a tattered hospital gown, her bare feet dirty and bruised. She was crying, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I took a step closer, and she looked up at me, her eyes wide with fear. They were empty, hollow, like she had been through something so horrible that it had broken her completely. But as I stared into those eyes, I felt a chill run down my spine. This wasn't just a woman. This was something else, something that had been trapped in this place for far too long. I tried to speak, to ask her who she was, but the words caught in my throat. She reached out to me, her hand trembling as it touched mine, and then everything went dark. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor of the asylum, my camera shattered beside me. My head was pounding, and I could taste blood in my mouth. I didn't know how long I had been out, but the sun was beginning to rise, casting a faint light through the broken windows. I stumbled to my feet, my body aching from the fall. The woman was gone, the room empty except for me and the wreckage of my gear. I didn't know what had happened or how I had ended up on the floor, but I knew one thing for sure: I had to get out of there. I grabbed what was left of my camera and made my way back to the window I had entered through. I climbed out, my hands shaking as I pulled myself up and over the ledge. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I never went back to Whitmore Asylum. I never showed anyone the photos I took that night. Some things are better left forgotten, buried in the past where they belong. But I can't forget that woman, the look in her eyes as she reached out to me. I can't forget the way her touch felt, cold and lifeless, like she was already dead. And sometimes in the dead of night I can still hear her voice, calling my name, asking me to come back. But I won't, because I know that if I do, I'll never leave that place again. It was supposed to be a quick weekend getaway, a chance to escape the city and breathe some fresh air. My friend, Daniel, had always been an avid outdoorsman, and he'd convinced me to join him on a hunting trip up to Devil's Ridge, a remote area known for its dense forests and rugged terrain. I wasn't much of a hunter, but the idea of spending a couple of days in the wilderness sounded appealing, especially after the long hours I'd been putting in at work. We set out early on a Friday morning, driving up the winding mountain roads as the sun slowly climbed higher in the sky. The air was crisp, and the leaves were starting to turn, painting the landscape in shades of red, orange, and yellow. By the time we reached the trailhead, it was late afternoon, and we had just enough time to hike to our campsite before dark. The trail was steep, winding through dense forests and over rocky outcrops. As we climbed higher, the trees began to thin, giving way to open meadows and sweeping views of the surrounding mountains. It was beautiful, almost surreal in its serenity, but there was something about the place that felt off. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to stretch just a little too long, or the way the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it a faint, unsettling scent. We reached the campsite just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in a deep, fiery glow. We set up our tent, gathered some firewood, and settled in for the night. Daniel was in high spirits, talking excitedly about the hunt, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of wildlife, the hoot of an owl, the rustle of leaves, the distant howl of a coyote. But beneath it all, there was another sound so faint I almost didn't hear it, a low, guttural growl echoing through the trees. I brushed it off as my imagination, maybe just the wind or some animal in the distance. But the feeling of unease only grew stronger. I couldn't put my finger on it, but something about the place didn't feel right. I tried to shake it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid, but that night sleep didn't come easily. The next morning, we set out early, rifles slung over our shoulders as we made our way deeper into the forest. The terrain was rough, the trees growing thicker, and the underbrush more tangled. We moved slowly, carefully, scanning the area for any signs of game. But there was nothing, no tracks, no droppings, no signs of life. It was as if the forest was empty, devoid of any animals. After a few hours, we decided to split up, hoping to cover more ground. I headed west, towards a rocky outcrop that overlooked a valley, while Daniel went east, disappearing into the dense underbrush. The silence was deafening, broken only by the crunch of leaves underfoot and the occasional snap of a twig. I reached the outcrop, and sat down to catch my breath, the vast expanse of the valley stretching out before me. It was beautiful, but in a cold, unforgiving way. As I sat there, I heard it again, that low, guttural growl. But this time it was closer, more distinct. I stood up, scanning the area, but there was nothing. Just trees and rocks, and the endless expanse of wilderness. Then I saw a flash of movement in the trees below. Something large, moving quickly through the underbrush. I raised my rifle, trying to get a better look, but whatever it was gone before I could get a bead on it. My heart was racing, adrenaline pumping through my veins as I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or a bear. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I started back towards the campsite, moving quickly, my senses on high alert. The forest seemed darker, the trees closer, as if the very landscape had shifted in my absence. The growl came again, this time from behind me, and I broke into a run, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. I reached the campsite just as the sun began to set, the sky turning a deep, bloody red. Daniel was already there, pacing back and forth, a worried look on his face. Before I could say anything, he told me he'd seen something big, something that wasn't human. We decided to pack up and leave. But as we were breaking down the tent, we heard it, a howl, long and mournful, echoing through the trees. It was close to close. We grabbed our rifles, scanning the area, but there was nothing, just the darkness closing in around us, and the sense that something was watching, waiting. We didn't waste any time. We grabbed our gear and started down the trail, moving as quickly as we could. But the forest seemed to close in on us, the path twisting and turning, leading us deeper into the woods instead of out. The howls grew louder, more frequent, and we could hear something crashing through the underbrush, getting closer with each passing minute. Panic set in, and we started running, our breath coming in ragged gasps as we fought our way through the dense underbrush. The trail was gone, swallowed up by the forest, and we were lost, with no way to tell which direction led back to the car. The howls were deafening now, surrounding us, coming from all sides. We burst into a clearing, and that's when we saw it. A creature standing on two legs, covered in thick, matted fur. It was massive, easily 7 feet tall, with a snarling, wolf-like face, and eyes that glowed with an unnatural light. It let out a low growl, baring its teeth, and took a step towards us. We didn't hesitate. We raised our rifles and fired, the shots ringing out through the clearing. The creature snarled, lunging towards us, and we fired again, our bullets hitting their mark, but it didn't go down. It staggered back, blood dripping from its wounds, but it kept coming, its eyes locked on us with a burning, primal fury. We turned and ran, not daring to look back, the sound of the creature's heavy footsteps thundering behind us. I could feel its breath on the back of my neck, smell the rancid stench of its fur. We were running out of time, out of options, and the realization hit me like a sledgehammer. We weren't going to make it out of here alive. But then, just as I was about to give up hope, the trees parted, and I saw the road. The car was just ahead, our salvation within reach. We sprinted towards it, the creature hot on our heels, and I could feel its claws brushing against my back as I threw myself into the driver's seat. Daniel jumped in beside me, and I slammed the door shut, fumbling for the keys with shaking hands. The creature was at the window now, its snarling face inches from mine, its claws raking across the glass. I finally found the keys, jammed them into the ignition, and the engine roared to life. I floored the gas pedal, the tires screeching as we tore down the road, the creature chasing us for a few hundred yards before it finally gave up, disappearing into the darkness. We didn't stop. didn't slow down until we were miles away, the forest far behind us. We never went back to Devil's Ridge. We never spoke about what happened that night, not to anyone, not even to each other. But the memory of it haunts me. The image of that creature burned into my mind. I don't know what it was or where it came from, but I know one thing for sure. It's still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. It was a typical Friday night, the streets of New York buzzing with the energy of the weekend. I was working the late shift, driving my cab through the city that never sleeps, picking up fares and dropping them off at their destinations. The night had been uneventful, just the usual mix of drunk partiers, tired office workers, and tourists trying to get back to their hotels. But as the clock ticked past midnight, something changed. I was parked outside a bar in the East Village, waiting for my next fare, when I saw her. She was standing on the corner, her pale skin glowing in the dim light of the street lamp. She looked lost, confused, her eyes darting around as if she wasn't sure where she was. I rolled down my window and called out to her, "Need a ride?" She turned to me, her eyes wide and vacant, and nodded. She walked over to the cab and got in, sliding into the back seat without a word. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, trying to get a better look at her. She was young, maybe in her early 20s, with long dark hair that hung limply around her face. She was wearing a simple white dress, the kind you'd wear to a summer party, but it was torn and dirty, like she'd been running through the streets. "Where to?" I asked, but she didn't answer. She just stared out the window, her eyes unfocused. I waited a moment, then tried again. "Miss, where do you want to go?" Still no response. She just sat there, silent, her hands clenched in her lap. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to shake it off. It was late. She was probably drunk or high, maybe just had a rough night. It wasn't my place to judge. I sighed and put the cab in gear, pulling away from the curb. "All right, I'll just drive around until you tell me where you want to go." The streets were unusually empty. The usual hustle and bustle of the city muted, as if the whole place was holding its breath. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the soft whisper of the tires on the pavement. I drove aimlessly, waiting for her to say something, to give me some kind of direction. But she just sat there, staring out the window, her expression blank. After a while, I started to get nervous. There was something off about her, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I glanced at her again in the mirror, and that's when I noticed it. Her reflection, it wasn't there. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding in my chest. I whipped around in my seat, my eyes wide, but she was still there, sitting in the back seat, as real as could be. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing or not seeing. "What the hell?" I muttered under my breath. I looked at her again, and this time she met my gaze, her eyes locking onto mine. There was something in them, something cold, something dead. My blood turned to ice. I didn't know what to do, didn't know what was happening. I'd heard stories, of course every cabbie has, ghost passengers, spirits of the dead hitching rides with the living, but I'd never believed them. They were just stories, urban legends to pass the time between fares. But this was real. Who are you?" I stammered, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just kept staring at me, her eyes boring into mine. I could feel the temperature in the cab dropping, the air growing colder with each passing second. My breath came out in visible puffs, my hands shaking as I gripped the steering wheel. I had to get out of there, had to get away from her, but my body wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear, and then, as suddenly as she had appeared, she was gone. One moment she was there, the next she wasn't, the back seat empty, the air warm again. I sat there, my heart racing, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. I looked around, but there was no sign of her, no trace that she had ever been there at all. I didn't know what to do. I didn't want to believe it, didn't want to accept that I'd just had a ghost in my cab. But I knew what I'd seen, what I hadn't seen. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself, and started driving again. I needed to get back to the garage, needed to end my shift and get out of that cab. But as I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I kept glancing in the mirror, half expecting to see her sitting there again, her empty eyes staring back at me. But the back seat remained empty, the city outside passing by in a blur. I finally made it back to the garage, pulling into the lot and shutting off the engine. I sat there for a moment, my hands still shaking, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do, didn't know who to tell, who would believe me. I got out of the cab, my legs unsteady, and walked into the office. The night manager, Tony, was sitting at his desk, flipping through a magazine. He looked up as I walked in, raising an eyebrow. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I froze, my blood running cold again. I opened my mouth to say something, to tell him what had happened, but the words wouldn't come. I just nodded, forcing a weak smile. "Yeah, just a long night." He nodded, not pressing the issue, and went back to his magazine. I signed out and headed home, my mind still reeling. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the ghostly passenger who had appeared out of nowhere and then vanished just as suddenly. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, those cold, dead eyes staring back at me. I kept hearing her voice, even though she hadn't spoken a word, whispering in my ear, telling me things I didn't want to hear. I didn't drive my cab for a few days after that. I couldn't bring myself to get back behind the wheel, couldn't face the possibility of seeing her again. But eventually, I had to go back to work. Bills had to be paid. Life had to go on. I tried to forget about it, tried to convince myself that it had all been in my head, a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But deep down, I knew the truth. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew that I'd never forget her, never forget that cold, empty stare, that feeling of dread that had washed over me when I realized she wasn't really there. I still drive my cab, still pick up fares, still navigate the streets of New York, but every time I pull up to a corner, every time I see a figure standing in the shadows, I hesitate. I wonder if it's her, if she's come back, if she's looking for another ride, and every time I pray that she's not, because I don't think I could survive another night with a ghost passenger. The small town of Black Creek had always been the kind of place where nothing much happened. Tucked away in the dense forest of northern Michigan, it was more of a forgotten dot on the map than a thriving community. The people who lived there were close-knit, used to the solitude, and content with their quiet lives. I had grown up there, and after a few years of living in the city, I returned, seeking the peace and simplicity I'd known as a child. I had taken up the job as a park ranger for the Black Creek National Forest. It wasn't a glamorous job by any means, but it was enough for me. The job mostly consisted of patrolling the park, ensuring that campers followed the rules, and occasionally helping lost hikers find their way back to the trail. The forest was vast, stretching for miles, with thick trees that seemed to swallow the sunlight even on the brightest of days. It was easy to lose yourself out there, both physically and mentally. It was late September, when the first signs of something unusual began to appear. The days were growing shorter, the nights cooler, and the forest was slowly beginning to change its colors. I was on a routine patrol when I found the first carcass. It was a deer, or what was left of one, lying in a small clearing about half a mile off the main trail. The animal had been savagely torn apart, its limbs scattered, its rib cage exposed. But what caught my attention wasn't just the brutality of the kill. It was the sheer size of the bite marks on its body. Whatever had done this was large, much larger than any predator that was supposed to inhabit these woods. I radioed it in, and my supervisor, Hank, told me to keep an eye out, but not to worry too much. Probably just a bear, he said. They're getting more desperate for food this time of year, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I'd seen bear kills before, and this was different. There was a ferocity to it that felt wrong. Over the next few days, more carcasses started turning up, always in remote areas, far from the main trails, and always brutally mangled deer, rabbits, even a fox. The bite marks were the same, large, powerful, like something that could crush bone with ease. I started to feel uneasy during my patrols, the weight of the forest pressing down on me, as if the trees were hiding something just out of sight. One evening, as I was finishing up my rounds, I heard something that chilled me to the bone. I was walking along a ridge, overlooking a dense thicket below, when a howl cut through the air. It wasn't the howl of a wolf or a coyote. It was deeper, more guttural, almost like a scream. It echoed through the trees, sending a shiver down my spine. I stood there, frozen, listening as the howl faded into the distance, leaving behind an eerie silence. That night I couldn't shake the sound from my mind. I'd heard plenty of animal calls in my time, but this was different. It was primal, filled with an anger that I couldn't explain. I told myself it was just a wolf, maybe a larger one than usual, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The next morning I decided to do some investigating of my own. I didn't mention it to Hank. He'd already brushed off my concerns once, and I didn't want to be seen as paranoid. I packed a bag with some supplies, grabbed my rifle, and headed out to the area where I'd heard the howl. The forest was unnervingly quiet that day, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. I made my way to the ridge where I'd stood the night before and began to search the area below. The thicket was dense, with underbrush that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. I pushed through, my senses on high alert, every rustle of leaves making me jump. After about an hour of searching, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. In a small, muddy clearing, I saw them footprints. They were unlike anything I had ever seen before. They were large, almost the size of a human foot, but the shape was all wrong. They were elongated, with what looked like claw marks extending from the toes. Whatever had made these tracks was walking on 2 legs. I knelt down, my heart racing as I traced the outline of one of the prints with my finger. It was fresh, the edges of the print still sharp in the mud. Whatever had made this was nearby, and it was big. I stood up slowly, my hand instinctively going to the rifle slung over my shoulder. I scanned the trees, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave. But I couldn't. I had to know what was out there. I followed the tracks for what felt like miles, deeper into the forest than I had ever ventured before. The trees grew thicker, the underbrush more tangled, and the sense of dread that had been building in my gut intensified with each step. The tracks led me to a ravine, a steep drop that cut through the forest like a scar. At the bottom, I could see the remnants of an old, collapsed bridge, the wood rotting and covered in moss. But that wasn't what caught my attention. On the far side of the ravine, partially hidden by the trees, was a cave. The mouth of the cave was wide and dark, the kind of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. The tracks led straight to it, disappearing into the inky blackness. I stood there for a long time, staring at the cave, my mind racing. Every instinct told me to turn back, to get out of there and never look back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was inside. I made my way down the side of the ravine, the loose soil and rocks making it difficult to keep my footing. By the time I reached the bottom, my hands were shaking, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I looked up at the cave, the darkness inside seeming to pulse. Like it was alive, I unshouldered my rifle and took a step forward, then another, each one heavier than the last. The entrance to the cave loomed above me, the air growing colder as I approached. I raised the rifle, the barrel trembling slightly as I aimed it into the darkness. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air in the cave was thick, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like blood. My flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, the beam swallowed by the shadows almost as soon as it left the bulb. I moved forward slowly, my footsteps echoing off the walls, the sound unnervingly loud. In the stillness, the cave was larger than I had expected, the tunnel widening as I went deeper. The walls were jagged, the floor uneven, and I had to be careful not to trip on the rocks scattered across the ground. I had no idea how far I had gone when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, a trick of the light, but as I moved the flashlight, I realized it was something much more sinister. It was a figure crouched in the corner of the cave, its back turned to me. It was large, much larger than any human, with broad shoulders and a hunched back. Its skin was dark, almost black, covered in patches of matted fur. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was looking at. The figure shifted, its head turning slowly towards me, and I saw its face, or what should have been a face. It was twisted, distorted, with a long snout and glowing, yellow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Its mouth was filled with sharp, jagged teeth, bared in a snarl. As it locked onto me, I froze, my heart pounding in my chest, my hands gripping the rifle so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The creature let out a low, cattle growl, the sound vibrating through the cave, rattling the rocks above. I knew in that moment that I was staring at something that shouldn't exist, something that defied all logic and reason. For what felt like an eternity, neither of us moved. The creature's eyes bore into mine, its growl growing louder, more aggressive. I knew I should run, that I should turn and get out of there as fast as I could. But I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my mind racing with thoughts of what this thing could do to me. Then, in a flash of movement, the creature lunged. I don't remember much of what happened next. It was all a blur of chaos and terror. I fired the rifle, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, but the creature was too fast. It was on me in an instant, its claws raking across my chest, its teeth snapping inches from my face. I fell back, the force of the impact knocking the wind out of me, and scrambled to get away, but it was relentless. I managed to fire another shot, this time hitting the creature in the shoulder. It let out a howl of pain, the sound echoing through the cave like a banshee's wail, and for a brief moment, I thought I might have a chance. I scrambled to my feet, the pain in my chest almost unbearable, and ran. I don't know how I made it out of that cave. The next thing I remember, I was stumbling through the forest, the sunlight blinding after the darkness of the cave. My chest was burning, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I didn't stop. I ran and ran, not caring where I was going, just needing to get as far away as possible. When I finally collapsed on the side of the trail, I was covered in blood, my own and the creature's. My chest was torn open, deep gashes running from my shoulder to my waist. I knew I needed help, but I couldn't bring myself to get up. I just lay there, the world spinning around me, the weight of what I had seen crashing down on me. I was found later that day by another ranger, unconscious and barely clinging to life. They rushed me to the hospital, where I spent the next several weeks recovering. The doctors couldn't believe I had survived, said it was a miracle I hadn't bled out. They asked me what had happened, what kind of animal had attacked me, but I couldn't tell them. How could I explain what I had seen, what I had fought? I never went back to Black Creek after that. As soon as I was well enough to travel, I packed up and left, never looking back. I couldn't stay, not after what I had seen. The memories of that night still haunt me, the creature's snarling face flashing before my eyes every time I close them. I know it's still out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest, waiting for its next victim, and I know that whatever it is, it's something that no one should ever have to face. The forest was my sanctuary, my escape from the chaos of the world. As a park ranger in the vast wilderness of Montana, I spent my days and nights patrolling the dense woods, ensuring that the beauty of nature remained untouched by human hands. The job wasn't easy, but it was fulfilling. I was responsible for maintaining trails, monitoring wildlife, and assisting hikers who ventured into the deep woods. But as much as I loved the forest, there was one area that I avoided: Whispering Pines. Whispering Pines was a remote section of the park, untouched by man and shrouded in mystery. The few who dared to venture here spoke of strange occurrences, voices carried by the wind, shadows that move on their own, and a feeling of being watched. Most dismissed these stories as mere legends, tales spun to scare newcomers. But I knew better. There was something in those woods, something that wasn't natural. It was late September when I received a call from headquarters. A hiker had gone missing near Whispering Pines. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor as I grabbed my gear and set out to search for the missing man. The air was crisp, the scent of pine and earth filling my lungs as I made my way toward the ominous part of the woods. As I walked, the familiar sounds of the forest surrounded me, the rustling of leaves, the distant call of an owl, the crunch of twigs underfoot. But as I approached Whispering Pines, the forest grew silent. It was as if the trees themselves were holding their breath, waiting. The stillness was unsettling, the only sound being the beating of my own heart, growing louder with each step I took. The sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the forest into darkness. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the night, casting eerie shadows on the trees. The trail before me was overgrown, barely visible under the thick blanket of fallen leaves. I pushed forward, my senses on high alert, every nerve in my body tingling with unease. I called out the hiker's name, my voice echoing through the trees, but there was no response, just the deafening silence. I continued on, the trail growing narrower, the trees closing in around me. The deeper I went, the more oppressive the air became, thick with an unnatural chill that seeped into my bones. My breath fogged in front of me, and I could see my own fear reflected in the mist. Then I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost imperceptible, carried on the wind. I froze, straining to hear, but the whisper was gone as quickly as it had come. My heart raced, a sense of dread washing over me. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just the wind, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But the feeling of being watched persisted, growing stronger with each passing moment. I pressed on, the whispering growing louder, more distinct. It was coming from all around me, voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. The words were soft, insistent, filling my head with their haunting melody. I turned in a circle, my flashlight beam sweeping through the trees. But there was no one there. I was alone, or so I thought. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement, a shadow darting between the trees. I spun around, my flashlight catching a glimpse of something dark, hunched over, watching me with eyes that glowed in the darkness. I gasped, stumbling backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The figure disappeared into the shadows, leaving me standing there, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Panic set in, my instincts screaming at me to run, to get out of there as fast as I could. But I couldn't leave, not without finding the missing hiker. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm, to focus. I called out again, my voice shaking, the whispering voices growing louder, more insistent. They were everywhere, surrounding me, filling the air with their eerie chant. Then I saw it, the hiker. He was standing in a small clearing, his back to me, his head tilted to the side as if listening to something. Relief washed over me, and I called out to him, running toward the clearing. But as I got closer, I noticed something was wrong. His posture was stiff, unnatural, his skin pale and lifeless. I stopped in my tracks, a cold wave of fear crashing over me. The hiker slowly turned to face me, his eyes vacant, devoid of any emotion. His mouth moved, but no sound came out, just a faint whisper that blended with the voices in the trees. I took a step back, my hands trembling, the flashlight slitting from my grasp and falling to the ground. The hiker took a step toward me, his movements slow and deliberate, like a puppet being controlled by unseen strings. I wanted to run, to get as far away from him as possible, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. As the hiker drew closer, he reached out to me, his hand cold and clammy, his touch sending a jolt of icy terror through my body. The whispering grew louder, deafening, the voices filling my head, drowning out all rational thought. I could feel my mind slipping, my sanity unraveling as the hiker's grip tightened on my arm. I don't know how I managed to break free, but somehow I did. I wrenched my arm away from his grasp and turned, running blindly through the forest, the voices chasing after me, their whispers echoing in my ears. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs gave out, collapsing to the ground in a heap, my body trembling with fear. When I finally dared to look back, the hiker was gone, the forest silent once more. I lay there for what felt like hours, too terrified to move, the cold earth seeping into my skin. Eventually, I forced myself to get up, to keep moving, to find my way out of the forest. The trail was gone, swallowed by the darkness, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there, to escape the nightmare that had engulfed me. By the time I made it back to the ranger station, it was dawn. My clothes were torn, my skin scratched and bruised, but I didn't care. I was alive. The other rangers found me slumped against the door, my eyes wild with fear, my body shaking uncontrollably. They took me inside, wrapped me in a blanket, and tried to get me to talk, but I couldn't. The words wouldn't come. All I could hear were the whispers, the haunting voices of whispering pines. They sent out a search party to look for the missing hiker, but they never found him. He was gone, vanished into the woods, swallowed by the darkness. I knew he wasn't coming back. Whatever had taken him, whatever had lured him into those cursed woods, wasn't going to let him go. I left the Park Service not long after that. I couldn't stay, couldn't bear the thought of going back into those woods, of hearing those whispers again. I moved to the city, far away from the forest, from the memories that haunted me. But even now, years later, I can still hear them, the voices of whispering pines, calling out to me, beckoning me back to the darkness. And every night, as I lie in bed, I pray that I never have to answer. Timber Ridge was the kind of place people came to when they wanted to disappear. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, it was a forgotten speck of a town, with one main road and more trees than people. Life moved slow there, the days blending into each other like the mist that clung to the mountains in the early mornings. I had taken up residence in a small cabin on the outskirts of town, looking for solitude after years of living in the chaos of the city. I was the night security guard for the Timber Ridge Logging Company. It was a quiet job, mostly consisting of making rounds through the yard, checking on the machinery, and ensuring that no one was trespassing. The logging company had seen better days. Most of the work was done by a skeleton crew, and the yard was often deserted, save for the occasional delivery truck or passing wildlife. It suited me fine. I liked the peace and quiet, the stillness of the night broken only by the rustling of leaves or the distant call of an owl. But there was something about the forest that made me uneasy, especially after the sun went down. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of being watched, that I couldn't shake. It was as if the forest itself was alive, aware, and not entirely friendly. It started with the sounds. At first they were distant, almost imperceptible, a faint rustling in the underbrush, a soft snapping of twigs. I told myself it was just the wind, or maybe a deer passing through, but there was a rhythm to the noises that didn't feel natural. They were too deliberate, too focused, as if something was moving through the woods with purpose. One night, as I was making my rounds, I heard something that stopped me in my tracks. It was a low growl, deep and resonant, that seemed to vibrate through the air. I froze, my flashlight sweeping through the trees, trying to pinpoint the source. The growl came again, closer this time, and I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a sound that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever encountered. I tried to convince myself it was just a bear, maybe a large one that had wandered too close to the yard. But the growl was unlike any bear I'd heard. It was more like a warning, a territorial challenge that sent a clear message. This was its domain, and I was trespassing. Over the next few nights, the growls became more frequent, more aggressive. They seemed to follow me as I made my rounds, always just out of sight, lurking in the shadows. I started to feel like I was being hunted, stalked by something that was far more dangerous than any bear or wolf. Then, one night I saw it. I was patrolling the perimeter of the yard, the full moon casting long shadows across the ground, when I caught a glimpse of movement out of the corner of my eye. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and saw it standing at the edge of the tree line. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, with a muscular, hunched body covered in coarse, dark fur. Its eyes glowed in the beam of my flashlight, a sickly yellow that seemed to pierce through the night. But it was the face that sent a jolt of terror through me. It was canine, like a wolf, but twisted, deformed, with a long snout and sharp, bared teeth. The creature was standing on 2 legs, its posture eerily human. But there was nothing human about the malice in its gaze. We stared at each other for what felt like an eternity, the air between us thick with tension. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. I wanted to run, to turn and flee, but my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Then, with a low growl that rumbled deep in its chest, the creature took a step forward. That was all it took to break the spell. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the dirt as I sprinted towards the safety of the guard shack. I could hear it behind me, the sound of its heavy footfalls growing closer, the growl turning into a snarl that sent adrenaline surging through my veins. I reached the guard shack and slammed the door shut, locking it with trembling hands. I backed away from the door, my eyes fixed on the small window, half expecting the creature to burst through at any moment. But it didn't. Instead, I heard it outside, circling the shack, its growls muffled but still menacing. I stayed in that shack for the rest of the night, my heart racing, my mind reeling from what I had seen. I didn't dare step outside until the first light of dawn began to break through the trees. When I finally did, the yard was empty, the creature gone, but the memory of those glowing eyes and snarling teeth was seared into my mind. I reported the incident to my boss the next day, but he just laughed it off, saying it was probably just a bear, and that I was letting my imagination get the best of me. But I knew what I had seen, and I knew it wasn't a bear. It was something far more dangerous, something that didn't belong in this world. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a change in the forest. The usual sounds of wildlife, birds chirping, squirrels chattering, the occasional rustle of a deer had gone silent. The forest felt empty, devoid of life, as if everything had fled from something they knew was out there. The unease I had felt before was now a constant presence, a nagging fear that something was watching, waiting. Then, one night, the creature came back. I was in the guard shack, going over the logs from the day, when I heard the growl again. This time it was closer, right outside the shack. My heart skipped a beat as I reached for the flashlight, but before I could even turn it on, the door shook violently, as if something had slammed into it with tremendous force. I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat. As the door shook again, the wood creaking under the strain, I could hear the creature outside, its growls turning into snarls, and I knew that if it wanted to, it could break down that door with ease. But it did in single quotes T. Instead. It started circling the shack again, its growls deep and menacing. I could hear its claws scraping against the wood, hear its heavy breathing as it prowled just outside. I backed away, my hands shaking, as I tried to keep my wits about me. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the growling stopped. The only sound was the pounding of my own heart in my ears. I waited, every muscle tense, but there was nothing, no growls, no footfalls, just an eerie silence that seemed to stretch on forever. I didn't move for what felt like hours, waiting for some sign that the creature was still there, but it never came. Eventually, I worked up the courage to approach the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the lock. I opened it just a crack, peering out into the night. There was nothing there. The yard was empty, the trees standing silent and still under the moonlight. But I knew it wasn't over. The creature had been there, and it would come back. I didn't finish my shift that night. I left the shack and drove straight back to my cabin, not caring about the job or the consequences. I couldn't stay there, not knowing that thing was out there, waiting in the darkness. The next day, I packed up my belongings and left Timber Ridge for good. I didn't tell anyone why, didn't share what I had seen with the other guards or the people in town. I knew they wouldn't believe me, would just write it off as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too much time alone in the woods. But I knew the truth. The dogman of Timber Ridge was real, and it was out there, somewhere in those dark, silent woods, and it was waiting. I moved far away from the mountains to a place where the closest thing to a forest was the local park, where the nights were filled with the comforting hum of city life. But no matter how far I go, I can't escape the memory of that night, the glowing eyes and snarling teeth that still haunt my dreams. I tried to forget, to move on, but I know I never will. The dogman is out there, and I can only hope that it stays in those mountains, far away from the world of men. Because if it ever decides to come down from those hills, if it ever decides to hunt again, there's nothing we can do to stop it. Driving long-haul routes was never easy. but it was a job I had grown accustomed to over the years. The open road, the solitude, the hum of the engine beneath me, all of it was strangely comforting. I had spent more nights in the cab of my truck than I had in my own bed, and though it was a lonely life, it was one I had chosen. But there was one night, one stretch of highway, that made me question everything I thought I knew about the road and the world beyond it. It was late fall, the kind of night where the cold seemed to seep into your bones, no matter how high you cranked the heater. I was hauling a load of produce from Kansas to Colorado, a route I'd driven countless times before. The highway was desolate, the landscape around me a blur of dark fields and shadowy trees. I'd been on the road for hours, my eyes heavy with exhaustion, but I was determined to push through and make it to my destination by morning. The clock on the dashboard read to 34 a.m. when I saw it, a faint glow on the horizon, like the distant lights of a town. But there shouldn't have been anything out there, no towns or cities for miles. I squinted, trying to make sense of it, but the glow only grew brighter as I got closer. It was then that I noticed something strange. The radio, which had been playing static for the last hour, suddenly crackled to life. An old country song drifted through the speakers. One I hadn't heard in years. I reached for the dial, trying to change the station, but the knob wouldn't budge. The song played on, the singer's voice low and mournful, the lyrics telling a story of love lost on a lonely highway. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a sense of unease creeping into my mind. The glow ahead grew stronger, and as I rounded a bend in the road, I saw it, a small, run-down truck stopped, bathed in an eerie yellow light. I blinked in surprise. I'd driven this route dozens of times, and had never seen this place before. The neon sign flickered above the entrance, the word diner barely legible through the grime that coated it. The parking lot was empty, save for a few rusted-out cars that looked like they hadn't moved in years. I slowed the truck, my curiosity getting the better of me as I pulled into the lot. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, the silence pressing in around me. The radio had gone dead again. The only sound now the ticking of the cooling engine. I glanced at the diner, its windows dark, the door slightly ajar. Something about the place didn't sit right with me, but I was too tired to care. I needed a break, and this was as good a place as any. I climbed out of the cab, the cold night air hitting me like a slap in the face. My breath puffed out in front of me as I made my way to the diner, the gravel crunching under my boots. The closer I got, the stronger the feeling of unease became, like an invisible hand pressing down on my chest. But I ignored it, pushing open the door and stepping inside. The interior was just as run down as the outside. The booths were torn and faded, the linoleum floor cracked and peeling. A faint smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke lingered in the air, and the only light came from a single flickering bulb above the counter. Behind the counter stood a woman, her back to me as she wiped down a coffee pot with a dirty rag. "Evening," I called out, trying to sound more cheerful than I felt. The woman didn't respond, didn't even turn around. I frowned, taking a step closer. "Excuse me," I tried again, but still nothing. She just kept wiping that coffee pot, her movements slow and deliberate, like she was stuck in some kind of loop. A chill ran through me, and I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to leave, to get back in my truck and drive as far away from this place as possible. But before I could move, the woman finally turned around. Her face was pale, almost translucent, her eyes sunken and hollow. She stared at me, her expression blank, her lips moving as if she were trying to speak, but no sound came out. I felt my blood run cold, my heart pounding in my chest as I stumbled back toward the door. But when I turned around, I froze. The door was gone, replaced by a solid wall. The diner seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an oppressive weight that made it hard to breathe. I spun around, my eyes wide with fear, searching for a way out, but there was none. The windows were gone, the walls closing in, the light above the counter flickering wildly. The woman behind the counter began to hum, a low, haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. Her eyes never left mine, her lips curling into a twisted smile as she reached out toward me. I backed away, my body trembling, my mind racing with panic. I had to get out, had to find a way to escape this nightmare, but the walls kept closing in, the diner shrinking around me, the woman's hum growing louder, more insistent. I could feel my sanity slipping, the darkness creeping in at the edges of my vision. I turned in circles, desperate for an escape, but there was none. The diner was a trap, a prison, and I was its latest victim. I don't know how long I was in there, how long I fought against the growing darkness, but at some point I must have blacked out. When I came to, I was lying in the cab of my truck, the engine idling, the morning sun streaming through the windshield. I sat up, my head spinning, my body drenched in sweat. For a moment I thought it had all been a dream, some twisted nightmare brought on by exhaustion. But when I looked at the clock on the dashboard, my blood ran cold. It was still 2:34 a.m. I glanced out the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The diner was gone, the parking lot empty, the highway stretching out before me like it always had. But the unease lingered, a cold knot of fear in the pit of my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened, something I couldn't explain, something that had left a mark on me, deep and unseen. I started the truck, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. I needed to get out of there, to put as much distance between me and that stretch of highway as possible. But as I pulled out onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. There, in the distance, I could see the diner, standing silently in the middle of the highway, bathed in that same eerie yellow light. I slammed my foot on the gas, the truck roaring to life as I sped down the highway, my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look back. I drove for hours, not daring to stop until the sun was high in the sky, the nightmare of the night before slowly fading in the light of day. But no matter how far I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that the diner was still out there, waiting, watching, and even now, years later, every time I drive that stretch of highway, I find myself glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that flickering neon sign, that run-down truck, stopped bathed in yellow light. I've tried to tell myself it was just a dream, just my mind playing tricks on me after too many hours on the road. But deep down, I know the truth. The road holds many secrets, many horrors, and I was lucky to escape with my life. But there are others out there, other truckers who might not be so lucky, who might find themselves lured into the trap that waits on that lonely stretch of highway. And to them I offer this warning. If you ever see a glow on the horizon, if you ever hear a voice on the radio that doesn't belong, don't stop. Keep driving, no matter how tired you are, no matter how lonely the road may seem. Because once you stop, once you step into that diner, you may never leave. I'd always been skeptical about the supernatural. Ghosts, demons, and all that talk of possession. It seemed like stuff out of horror movies, not real life. My job as a social worker often brought me into contact with families dealing with extreme stress, but never anything that I couldn't explain. At least, that's what I thought until I was assigned to a case that would make me question everything I believe. It all started with a routine call. A family in Willow Creek had been reported by a neighbor for disturbing behavior. The report mentioned screams in the middle of the night, strange noises coming from the house, and the family's teenage daughter, Emily, acting erratically. It sounded like a typical case of domestic trouble, perhaps exacerbated by mental health issues. So I didn't think much of it as I drove out to the remote farmhouse on a gray, drizzly afternoon. The house itself was old and isolated, standing on the edge of a dense forest that seemed to swallow up the last remnants of daylight. As I approached the front door, I noticed the windows were covered with heavy curtains, blocking out any view of the inside. A feeling of unease settled over me, but I shook it off. I'd seen plenty of neglected homes in my line of work. I knocked on the door, and after a long pause, it creaked open. Mrs. Harris, a gaunt woman with hollow eyes and unkempt hair, stood in the doorway. Her expression was one of exhaustion, mixed with something I couldn't quite place fear. "Maybe you're the social worker?" she asked in a voice that was barely more than a whisper. I nodded and introduced myself. She stepped aside, allowing me to enter. The inside of the house was dim, with only a few lamps casting weak light in the corners of the room. The air was heavy, almost stifling, and there was a lingering smell of something sour, like spoiled milk. As we sat down in the living room, I asked about Emily. Mrs. Harris hesitated before responding, glancing nervously towards the staircase that led to the second floor. "She's not well," she said finally. "It started a few months ago. At first, we thought it was just teenage mood swings, but then she began talking to herself, saying things that didn't make sense. And the screams, oh God, the screams," she shuddered, and for a moment I could see the raw fear in her eyes. I asked if I could speak with Emily, and after another moment of hesitation, she agreed. We climbed the creaking stairs, each step echoing in the silence of the house. The hallway upstairs was even darker than the rest of the house, with shadows pooling in the corners. Mrs. Harris led me to a door at the end of the hall and knocked softly. "Emily," she called out, her voice trembling. "There's someone here to see you." There was no response, just a heavy silence that seemed to press down on us. Mrs. Harris slowly opened the door, revealing a small, dimly lit room. The curtains were drawn tight, and the only light came from a flickering candle on the bedside table. Emily was sitting on the bed, her back to us, her long, dark hair hanging in tangled strands around her shoulders. She was rocking back and forth, her movements slow and rhythmic, almost trance-like. "Emily, this is Mr. Rogers," her mother said, trying to sound calm. "He's here to help." I stepped into the room, trying to get a better look at her face, but she kept her head down, her hair obscuring her features. I introduced myself again, but she didn't respond. Instead, she continued to rock back and forth, humming a low, dissonant tune that sent a chill down my spine. There was something off about the whole situation, something that set off alarm bells in my mind. I asked Emily how she was feeling, trying to keep my voice gentle, but she remained silent. Then, without warning, she stopped rocking and slowly turned her head to face me. Her eyes were what struck me first. They were dark, almost black, and seemed to hold a depth of malevolence that didn't belong in the eyes of a teenager. Her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes, and her lips were twisted into a smile that sent a jolt of fear through me. "Emily," I asked, my voice trembling slightly, "can you tell me what's been going on?" She didn't answer. Instead, she tilted her head to the side, her smile widening, and began to speak in a voice that wasn't her own. It was deep, guttural, and filled with malice, a voice that seemed to echo in the small room. "They can't help you," she said, her words slow and deliberate. "No one can help you." A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I realized that the voice wasn't coming from Emily. It was coming from something else, something that had taken hold of her. I've dealt with mental illness before, but this was different. This was something darker, Something I couldn't explain. "Emily, please," her mother pleaded, stepping forward. But Emily, or whatever was inside her, laughed, a sound that was more like a growl than anything human. "I'm not Emily," the voice said, its tone mocking. "Emily is gone." At that moment I felt a surge of pure terror. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to handle something like this. My rational mind was screaming that this wasn't real, that it had to be some kind of elaborate prank or delusion. But deep down I knew that wasn't the case. A room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening as the temperature dropped. I could see my breath in the air, small puffs of white vapor that hung in the silence. Emily, or whatever had taken control of her, stood up slowly, her movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. "I need to leave," I thought, panic rising in my chest. But my legs wouldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear my eyes away from the horrifying sight in front of me. Emily's head snapped to the side, her dark eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "You can't escape," the voice hissed, its words dripping with malice. "You'll never escape." In that moment I felt something inside me break, a primal fear that I had never experienced before. I turned and ran, barreling out of the room and down the stairs, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for air in the cool night. I could hear Mrs. Harris crying behind me, her sobs echoing through the empty house. But I didn't go back. I drove straight to the nearest church, my mind racing with what I had just witnessed. The priest listened to my frantic recounting of the events with a grave expression, and, without a word, he began gathering supplies: a crucifix, holy water, a Bible. He didn't need to ask for details. He knew. The priest and I returned to the Harris house as the first rays of dawn began to creep over the horizon. The house was eerily silent as we entered, the air thick with a sense of dread. We found Mrs. Harris in the living room, her eyes red and puffy from crying, but Emily was nowhere to be seen. "She's upstairs," Mrs. Harris whispered, her voice trembling. "She's been waiting." The priest led the way, his faith a solid anchor in the storm of fear that surrounded us. When we reached Emily's room, the door was already open, as if inviting us in. The priest stepped inside, holding the crucifix before him, his voice steady as he began to recite prayers. Emily was standing in the center of the room, her back to us, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. The moment the priest began to speak, she let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed through the house, a sound so filled with rage and pain that it made my blood run cold. I'd heard the stories all my life, growing up in the small town of Blackwater, tales of a creature lurking in the dense woods that surrounded our quiet community. Some called it a werewolf, others just a big dog, but the locals all had one name for it: the Dogman. I never gave much thought to the stories, chalking them up to old wives' tales meant to scare kids into behaving. But that changed one night when I found myself face to face with the legend. It was late October, the air crisp and filled with the scent of decaying leaves as I walked home from my friend's house. The path through Blackwater Woods was the quickest route, and, despite the eerie tales, it had always been my preferred way home. The woods were thick with towering trees that blocked out most of the moonlight, but I knew the trail by heart. That night something felt different. The usual sounds of the forest crickets, the rustle of leaves in the wind were absent. Instead, there was an oppressive silence that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I quickened my pace, telling myself that it was just the cold making me anxious. As I neared the halfway point where the trail dipped into a small ravine, I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere ahead of me. I froze, my heart racing as I strained to see through the darkness. The growl came again, closer this time, sending a chill down my spine. I wanted to turn back, to run home the long way around, but my legs wouldn't move. It was like I was rooted to the spot, my body betraying me as the growl grew louder, more menacing. And then I saw its glowing eyes, reflecting the faint light of the moon, staring at me from the underbrush. They were too high off the ground to belong to a dog, and too far apart for any animal I knew. I could barely make out the shape of a massive figure, hunched and covered in fur, its breath visible in the cold night air. The creature stepped forward, revealing more of its former broad chest, muscular limbs, and a head that was unmistakably canine, but with an intelligence in its eyes that no animal should possess. My mind screamed at me to run, but I couldn't. I was paralyzed by fear as the dogman continued to approach, its growl reverberating in my chest like a drumbeat. It stopped a few feet from me, its eyes boring into mine, and for a moment I thought it was going to attack. But then it did something I didn't expect. It stood up on two legs. The sight of this hulking beast towering over me was too much. I snapped out of my trance and bolted, sprinting down the trail as fast as my legs would carry me. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it behind me, its heavy footsteps thudding on the ground as it gave chase. I ran like I'd never run before, my lungs burning and my legs screaming for relief. But I didn't stop. The path twisted and turned, the darkness disorienting me as I tried to find my way back to town. The creature's growls grew fainter, but I could still sense it nearby, stalking me through the trees. Finally, I burst out of the woods and onto the main road, nearly collapsing in relief. The street lights cast a reassuring glow, and I could see the lights of my house in the distance. I didn't stop running until I was inside, the door locked and bolted behind me. I never spoke about what happened that night, not to anyone. Who would believe me? But I know what I saw, and I know it wasn't just my imagination. The dogman is real, and it's still out there, lurking in the shadows of Blackwater Woods, waiting for its next victim. I haven't set foot in those woods since, and I don't plan to ever again. The exorcism was like nothing I had ever seen. Emily thrashed and convulsed, her body contorting in ways that seemed impossible. The voice inside her screamed obscenities, threatened us, and begged for mercy all at once. The priest never wavered, his prayers growing louder, more forceful, as he commanded the entity to leave. It felt like hours passed in that small, dark room, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and something foul that made my stomach churn. And then, finally, with one last agonized scream, Emily collapsed to the floor, silent and still. For a long moment, none of us moved. The room was eerily quiet, the only sound the ragged breathing of the priest. He slowly approached Emily, kneeling beside her and gently placing a hand on her forehead. She was unconscious, but alive. Mrs. Harris rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as she cradled her daughter in her arms. I stood there, numb, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. The priest turned to me, his expression weary but resolute. "She's free now," he said quietly, "but she will need time to heal." I nodded, still in shock, as Mrs. Harris thanked the priest through her sobs. I left the house in a daze, my mind replaying the events over and over, trying to find some logical explanation, but there was none. I never returned to Willow Creek. I couldn't. The memory of that night haunted me, a constant reminder of the darkness that exists beyond the realm of reason. I left my job as a social worker soon after, unable to continue in a field that now seemed so trivial in the face of what I had witnessed. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that house. I don't know if it was truly a possession or something else, something darker and more sinister than I can comprehend. But I do know one thing. Whatever it was real, and it left a scar on my soul that will never fully heal. It was a moonless night when the terror began, the kind of night that clung to you like a second skin, where the darkness seemed to swallow everything, leaving you alone with nothing but your thoughts and the sounds of the desert. I was staying at my uncle's place in rural Arizona, a small, isolated house that sat at the edge of the Navajo Nation. It was a quiet life out there, peaceful in its own way, but also unsettling in the way the vast emptiness stretched out in every direction, making you feel like you were the last person on earth. That night I had just finished dinner and was settling into the worn leather couch in the living room, a beer in hand, when I heard it, a sound that sent a jolt of fear through me. Despite the years I'd spent out here, despite the countless nights I'd heard coyotes howl and the wind whisper through the scrub, this sound was different, though. It was a knock, soft but insistent. At the front door I froze, my hand gripping the beer can so tightly I thought it might crush. My uncle's house was miles from the nearest neighbor, and no one ever just showed up out here, especially not in the dead of night. I listened, my heart thudding in my chest, but the knock came again, louder this time, more urgent. It was then that I remembered the stories, the old tales my uncle had told me when I was a kid, stories of creatures that walked in the night, creatures that could take on the form of any animal or person they pleased. Skinwalkers, he called them, witches who had gained dark powers through unspeakable acts. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease that was creeping into my mind. Skinwalkers were just stories, tales to keep children from wandering too far from home. But as I sat there, staring at the door, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. The knock came again, and this time there was a voice, a low, gravelly voice that didn't quite sound human. "Let me in," it said, the words drawn out, almost like a growl. I didn't move, didn't even breathe, my eyes locked on the door. "Let me in," the voice repeated, more insistent, more demanding. I wanted to get up, to walk to the door and see what was out there, but my body refused to obey. I was paralyzed with fear, every instinct in me screaming to stay put, to not open that door. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours, the voice outside growing angrier, more desperate with each repetition. I could hear it pacing on the porch, the sound of heavy footsteps moving back and forth. Then, without warning, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more unnerving, the kind that makes your skin crawl, makes your heart pound in your ears. I strained to listen, my mind racing with thoughts of what could be lurking just outside. Suddenly, the voice came again, this time right outside the window, just inches from where I sat. "Let me in," it hissed, the words slithering through the crack in the window like a serpent. I jumped, nearly dropping my beer, my eyes darting to the window. There was nothing there, just the dark reflection of the room inside, but I could feel it, the presence of something evil, something that shouldn't be. My uncle had always told me that if a skinwalker ever came to your door, you should never let it in. Never acknowledge its presence, because once you did, you were as good as dead. But as the voice continued to whisper, continued to plead, I felt my resolve weakening. It sounded almost human, almost like someone in need, and, despite my fear, a small part of me wanted to help, wanted to see who was out there. I was about to stand up, about to move toward the door, when a new sound cut through the night. A howl, loud and piercing, coming from somewhere out in the desert. The voice outside went silent, and for a moment, all I could hear was the blood rushing in my ears. Then, as quickly as it had started, the knocking stopped. The footsteps ceased, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted, leaving me sitting there in stunned silence. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, my eyes fixed on the door, waiting for the knock to return, for the voice to come back, but it never did. The sun eventually rose, and with it came a sense of relief, though it was tempered by the knowledge that whatever had visited me that night was still out there, still waiting. The next day I told my uncle about what had happened, expecting him to laugh it off, to tell me it was just a trick of the wind or my imagination playing tricks on me. But he didn't. Instead, he looked at me with a seriousness I had never seen before, his eyes dark and somber. He told me that what I had encountered was real, that the skinwalkers were not just stories, but beings that existed in the shadows, preying on those who ventured too far into their territory. He warned me to be careful, to never let my guard down, because once a skinwalker marked you, it wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. He said that I was lucky, that the howl I heard had scared it off, but that I shouldn't rely on luck to save me again. I needed to be vigilant, to protect myself, because the skinwalker would return, and next time I might not be so fortunate. I spent the next few nights on edge, jumping at every sound, every creak of the house. The thought of leaving crossed my mind more than once, but I couldn't bring myself to abandon my uncle. He was getting older, and though he was strong in his beliefs and his understanding of the old ways, I couldn't help but worrying about what might happen if he was left alone. The days passed without incident, but the nights were a different story. I could feel it watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I started keeping a shotgun by my side, though I knew deep down that it wouldn't be enough to stop whatever was out there. The sense of dread grew with each passing night, until finally I couldn't take it anymore. I had to do something, anything, to rid myself of the skinwalker's curse. I spoke to my uncle, told him about the fear that was eating away at me, and he nodded in understanding. He told me there was a way, a ritual that could banish the skinwalker and break its hold on me, but it was dangerous, and it required a great deal of strength and courage. I agreed without hesitation, desperate to be free of the terror that had taken over my life. That night, we gathered the necessary items, a sacred drum, and a bundle of cedar wood, and made our way to the edge of the desert. My uncle led the ritual, chanting in the old language, the words foreign and powerful. The fire we built crackled and roared, the smoke rising into the night sky like a beacon. I sat beside him, my heart pounding, my hands trembling as I clutched the shotgun in my lap. The wind picked up, howling through the desert, carrying with it the scent of sage and cedar. My uncle's voice grew louder, more intense, and I could feel the air around us thickening, the presence of something dark and malevolent closing in. The fire flickered, the flames dancing wildly as if struggling against an unseen force. Then I heard the voice from that night, whispering on the wind, begging to be let in. My blood ran cold, but I held my ground, refusing to give in to the fear that threatened to overwhelm me. My uncle continued to chant, his voice rising above the wind, commanding the spirit to leave, to release its hold on me. The air grew colder, the fire sputtering as the wind whipped around us. I could feel the skinwalker's anger, its desperation as it tried to break through the barrier my uncle had created. But he was strong, his connection to the old ways unbreakable, and slowly the darkness began to lift, the oppressive weight easing as the ritual drew to a close. Finally, the wind died down, the fire burning steady once more. My uncle finished the chant, his voice softening as he offered a prayer of thanks to the spirits. I sat there in stunned silence, the shotgun still clutched in my hands, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. The skinwalker was gone, banished back to the shadows from which it came, but the memory of that night, of the terror I had felt, would stay with me forever. My uncle told me that I was safe now, that the ritual had severed the skinwalker's connection to me, but he also warned me to be cautious, to never let my guard down completely. The desert was a place of mystery and danger, a place where the old ways still held power, and where creatures like the skinwalker roamed. I left my uncle's house a few days later, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched, that something was still out there, waiting for me to slip up. I never went back to that stretch of desert, never dared to venture into the darkness again. But the lessons I learned, the fear that gripped me that night, have stayed with me. The skinwalker may be gone, but the knowledge that there are things out there, things that defy explanation, is something I'll carry with me for the rest of my life. So, if you ever find yourself out in the desert, alone and far from civilization, and you hear a knock at the door or a voice whispering in the wind, remember this. Don't open the door, don't acknowledge the voice, because once you do, there's no turning back, and the skinwalker will come for you too.